The radio crackled to life at exactly 3:47 a.m., and what I heard through the static made me understand that we were never meant to leave this place. My name is David Crane, and I'm a geological surveyor for North Point Mining Corporation. I've spent the better part of 15 years mapping mineral deposits across Alaska's most remote territories, but nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared me for what happened on Kiska Island in March of 2024. The assignment seemed routine enough when Regional Director Henderson called me into his Anchorage office that gray Tuesday morning. Kiska Island, one of the rat islands in the western Aleutian chain, had been flagged for potential rare earth mineral deposits based on satellite geological surveys. The island had been uninhabited since the end of World War II, when the Japanese abandoned their occupation, leaving behind only crumbling concrete bunkers and rusted equipment scattered across its windswept landscape. Simple 3-day survey, Henderson explained, sliding a manila folder across his mahogany desk. You and Rodriguez will helicopter in, set up base camp, collect core samples from the marked coordinates, and helicopter out. Weather window looks good for the next week. Carlos Rodriguez was my usual field partner, a quiet, methodical man in his late 30s who'd worked these remote sites almost as long as I had. We'd survived ice storms in the Brooks Range, equipment failures on the North Slope, and more close calls with wildlife than either of us cared to remember. If I had to be stranded anywhere with someone, Carlos was my first choice. The helicopter ride from Dutch Harbor took 4 hours through increasingly hostile weather. Our pilot, a grizzled ex-military man named Peterson, had to navigate around 2 separate storm systems before finally approaching Kiska's rocky shoreline. The island appeared through the cockpit window like a brown scar against the gray Bering Sea, 12 miles long and 3 miles wide of treeless volcanic rock, carpeted with tundra grass and patches of dirty snow. Not exactly a vacation spot, Peterson shouted over the rotor noise as we circled, looking for a landing site near the survey coordinates. The island's geography was harsh and unforgiving, steep cliffs dropping into churning seas, interior ridges cutting through marshy lowlands, and everywhere the skeletal remains of military infrastructure slowly being reclaimed by the elements. We touched down on a relatively flat section of tundra, about half a mile inland from the western shore. The moment Peterson cut the engines, the silence hit us like a physical force. No birds, no insects, no sound except the distant crash of waves against the cliffs and the whistle of wind through rusted metal. Even for Alaska, the desolation felt profound. "I'll be back Thursday morning," Peterson said as we unloaded our equipment. "Radio check every day at 1800 hours. If the weather turns, I might be delayed, but I've got your emergency beacon frequencies monitored." We watched his helicopter disappear into the overcast sky, its sound fading until only the wind remained. Carlos and I stood in the sudden quiet, surrounded by our gear. Surveying equipment, core drilling tools, enough food and fuel for 5 days, and our small but reliable shelter that would be home for the next 72 hours. "Cheerful place," Carlos muttered, shouldering his pack. His voice carried strangely in the thin air, seeming to echo off invisible surfaces. As we began setting up camp near a crumbling concrete structure that might once have been a Japanese observation post, I noticed the first peculiarity. The ground around the building was littered with small bones. Bird bones, I thought initially, though they seemed too large and the wrong shape for any seabirds I knew. Carlos saw me examining them and knelt down beside me. "Weird," he said, picking up what looked like a femur about 4 inches long. "Too big for the rats they claim live here, too small for anything else that should be on this island." I took photographs and made notes, following standard protocol for any unusual findings. At the time, I assumed they were from some species of seabird I wasn't familiar with. Looking back now, I realize those bones should have been our first warning that something was very wrong with Kiska Island. As the afternoon wore on, we established our base camp inside the concrete structure, which provided some shelter from the constant wind. The walls were thick enough to muffle the external noise, but they also seemed to amplify every small sound we made. Our footsteps, our voices, even our breathing echoed strangely in the confined space. By evening, we'd completed our initial site survey and marked the locations where we'd begin core drilling the next morning. The coordinates provided by the company placed our primary targets in a depression about 2 miles northeast of our camp, near what our maps indicated was a series of caves or lava tubes. The geological formations looked promising for the mineral deposits we were hoping to find. That first night, as I settled into my sleeping bag with the wind howling outside our shelter, I felt an uneasiness I couldn't quite identify. It wasn't the isolation. I'd camped in far more remote locations. It wasn't the weather, which was actually milder than forecast. There was something else, something that made the hair on my arms stand up and kept me listening to every sound beyond our walls. Around midnight, I heard what sounded like footsteps on the concrete outside our shelter. Slow, deliberate footsteps that seemed to circle our building several times before stopping directly outside our entrance. I lay still, holding my breath, straining to hear over Carlos's steady breathing and the wind. The steps resumed, closer now, as if someone was standing just outside our door. I grabbed my flashlight and carefully approached the entrance, but when I opened the heavy metal door and swept the beam across the ground outside, I saw nothing. No footprints in the muddy earth, no disturbance in the scattered debris, just the endless Alaskan night and the sound of wind through metal. "Everything okay?" Carlos called softly from his sleeping bag. "Yeah," I replied, though my heart was still racing. "Just checking the weather." I closed the door and returned to my sleeping bag, but it was hours before I finally fell asleep. And even then, my dreams were filled with the sound of those deliberate footsteps, circling our shelter like a predator testing for weaknesses. The next morning brought low clouds and a persistent drizzle that made everything look gray and lifeless. Carlos and I packed our drilling equipment and headed toward the primary survey coordinates, following compass bearings across the uneven terrain. The ground was spongier than expected, our boots sinking into moss and permafrost that squelched with each step. The landscape of Kiska Island was unlike anywhere I'd surveyed before. Twisted metal fragments jutted from the earth at random intervals, pieces of aircraft, vehicles, and equipment left behind by both Japanese and American forces during the war. Nature had begun reclaiming these artifacts, covering them with rust and lichen, but their presence gave the entire island an unsettling feeling of abandonment. "Look at this," Carlos called, standing beside what appeared to be the remains of a military bunker. The concrete structure was partially collapsed, its entrance blocked by fallen timber and debris. But what caught my attention was the pattern of scratches covering the exposed walls, deep gouges in the concrete that looked almost like claw marks. I approached for a closer examination, running my fingers along the grooves. They were too large and deep to have been made by any animal I could think of, and too systematic to be random weather damage. The scratches formed parallel lines, as if something with multiple talons had repeatedly scraped against the concrete surface. "Bears don't live on these islands," Carlos said, voicing what we both were thinking. "And these marks are too fresh to be from the war." I photographed the scratches from multiple angles, making detailed notes about their size, depth, and pattern. The concrete around them showed no other signs of recent damage, no weathering, no plant growth covering them. Whatever had made these marks had done so recently. We continued toward our drilling coordinates, but the sense of unease that had bothered me the previous night only intensified. The island felt wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. There was too much silence where there should have been life. Too many signs of disturbance where there should have been only weather and time. Our first core sample site was located in a depression surrounded by low ridges, exactly as indicated on our geological surveys. But when we began setting up the drilling equipment, we discovered that someone or something had been there before us. The ground showed clear signs of recent excavation, areas where earth had been moved and replaced, patches where the vegetation had been disturbed, and several holes that appeared to have been filled in hastily. "This doesn't make sense," I said, examining one of the filled holes. "According to our records, no one's been on this island for any kind of scientific work since the 1980s. Carlos was using a probe to test the depth of the disturbances. "These aren't old," he reported. "Some of this digging looks like it happened within the last few months." We proceeded with our scheduled drilling, but the anomalies multiplied as the day progressed. Several of our core samples brought up materials that didn't match the geological surveys, chunks of concrete and metal fragments mixed with earth and rock. More disturbing were the organic materials we found: bones, hair, and what looked like pieces of fabric, all embedded in soil layers that should have been undisturbed for decades. Around midday, while Carlos was operating the drill, I heard a sound that made me freeze. It was a voice, human, but distant and muffled, as if someone was calling from underground. I signaled Carlos to stop the drill, and we both listened intently. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. Carlos nodded grimly. "Sounded like someone calling for help." We spent the next hour searching the immediate area, calling out and listening for responses. The sound didn't repeat, but we discovered something that made my stomach clench with dread. About 50 yards from our drilling site, hidden beneath a tangle of dead vegetation, we found a tent. It was a modern, high-quality camping tent in earth-tone colors, designed for extreme weather conditions. The fabric was torn in several places, and the aluminum frame was bent and twisted as if something had attacked it from the outside. Personal belongings were scattered around the collapsed structure: a sleeping bag shredded beyond repair, a backpack with its contents strewn across the ground, and a small camp stove that looked like it had been smashed repeatedly against the rocks. "Jesus," Carlos breathed, examining the damaged equipment. "Someone was camping here recently." I found a waterproof case that contained identification documents. The name on the driver's license was Dr. Patricia Moore, a marine biologist from the University of Alaska. The dates on her research permits indicated she'd been authorized to conduct studies on Kiska Island from February 15th to March 1st, 2024, just 3 weeks before our arrival. "We need to report this immediately," I said, reaching for our satellite radio. But when I tried to establish contact with our base in Dutch Harbor, I got nothing but static. I adjusted frequencies, checked connections, and tried different antennas, but the radio remained silent. "Could be the weather," Carlos suggested, though his voice betrayed his own doubts. I wanted to believe him, but the heavy feeling in my chest told me otherwise. We were supposed to have redundant communication systems precisely to prevent this kind of isolation. The fact that our primary radio was malfunctioning just as we discovered evidence of another researcher's disappearance felt like more than coincidence. We spent the rest of the afternoon documenting everything we found: the damaged campsite, the scattered equipment, and the obvious signs that Dr. Moore's research had ended violently. I took dozens of photographs and recorded detailed descriptions of every item, hoping that when we finally re-established communication, we'd have enough evidence to trigger a proper search and rescue operation. As evening approached, we returned to our shelter carrying samples from the day's drilling and a growing sense that we were not alone on the island. The temperature was dropping, and the persistent drizzle had turned into a cold rain that seemed to penetrate every layer of our clothing. "We should try the radio again," Carlos said as we prepared dinner inside our concrete shelter. The LED lanterns cast dancing shadows on the walls, making the scratches we'd noticed earlier seem to move and shift in the flickering light. I spent 20 minutes working with the radio, trying every frequency and protocol I knew. Finally, just as I was about to give up, I managed to establish a weak connection with someone, not our base, but what sounded like a commercial fishing vessel somewhere in the Bering Sea. "This is David Crane, Geological Survey Team on Kiska Island," I transmitted. "We have an emergency situation and need to relay a message to North Point Mining Corporation in Anchorage. Can you assist?" The response was heavily distorted by static, but I managed to catch fragments. "Copy your transmission. Weather system moving in. Communication difficult." Before I could provide more details, the connection died completely. Despite another hour of attempts, I couldn't raise any response from anyone. "At least someone knows we're here," Carlos said, though neither of us felt particularly reassured. That night, as we settled into our sleeping bags, the sounds began again. Footsteps on the concrete outside, but this time they were accompanied by other noises. Scratching sounds like fingernails on metal, low thuds as if something was testing the strength of our walls, and occasionally a sound that made my blood freeze, what sounded like human voices, but distorted and coming from multiple directions at once. "Do you hear that?" I whispered to Carlos. "Yeah," he replied, his voice tight with tension. "Sounds like there's more than one of them out there." We lay in the darkness, listening to the sounds circling our shelter. Sometimes they would stop completely, leaving only the wind and rain, then resume with increased intensity. Around 3 a.m. something began rhythmically striking the metal door, not hard enough to break it, but consistent enough to make it clear that whatever was outside knew exactly where we were. "Tomorrow," I said quietly, "we need to find a way off this island." Carlos's agreement was immediate and emphatic. Whatever was happening on Kiska Island, we both understood that staying any longer would be a mistake we might not survive to regret. Dawn brought no relief from the previous night's terrors. If anything, the gray morning light revealed signs that made our situation seem even more desperate. The area around our shelter was covered with tracks, not animal tracks, but marks that looked disturbingly like bare human footprints. Dozens of them, circling our building in concentric patterns that suggested hours of methodical stalking. "These are fresh," Carlos said, kneeling beside one particularly clear print. It was definitely human, but wrong in ways that made my skin crawl. The toes were too long, the arch too high, and there were what appeared to be claw marks extending beyond where the toenails should have ended. I photographed everything, though I was beginning to doubt we'd live to show these images to anyone. The radio remained completely dead, despite my increasingly desperate attempts to establish contact. Our emergency beacon was our only remaining link to the outside world, but activating it would signal a life-threatening emergency and trigger a costly rescue operation that might be impossible given the deteriorating weather. We made a grim decision. One more day of surveying to gather the evidence we needed to document what was happening on Kiska Island. Then we'd activate the beacon regardless of consequences. If something had happened to Dr. Moore and potentially other researchers, the authorities needed to know. Our target for the day was the cave system mentioned in our geological reports. The entrance was located about 3 miles from our camp, near the island's eastern shore, where the terrain dropped into a series of rocky ravines. According to our maps, the caves were part of an old lava tube system that might contain the mineral deposits North Point was hoping to find. The hike to the caves took us through the most desolate part of the island. Here, the remains of the military occupation were more concentrated. Rusted vehicles, collapsed buildings, and scattered equipment created an obstacle course of twisted metal and crumbling concrete. But it was the smell that hit us first. A sickly sweet odor of decay that grew stronger as we approached the cave entrance. "That's not normal decomposition," Carlos said, covering his nose with his sleeve. He'd worked enough remote sites to recognize the smell of various kinds of decay, and this was something different, more intense, and with an underlying chemical component that burned our nostrils. The cave entrance was larger than our maps indicated, easily 10 feet wide and 15 feet high. But what stopped us cold were the obvious signs of recent human activity. Equipment was scattered around the opening, scientific instruments, camping gear, and several items that looked like they belonged to Dr. Moore's expedition. Everything was damaged, scattered as if thrown about in violence or panic. "We shouldn't go in there," Carlos said quietly. I knew he was right, but we needed answers. "Just inside the entrance," I replied. "Enough to document what's in there, then we get out." We approached cautiously, flashlights ready, documenting everything we saw. Just inside the cave mouth, the smell of decay became overwhelming. Our lights revealed why. Scattered across the cave floor were the remains of multiple large animals, seals, sea lions, and what looked like several large fish, all in various stages of decomposition. But these weren't normal animal remains. The carcasses had been systematically dismembered, torn apart with a precision that suggested intelligence rather than predation. Bones were scattered in patterns, organs arranged in ways that seemed almost ritualistic. Most disturbing of all, many of the bones showed the same scratching marks we'd seen on the concrete bunker walls. "God Almighty," Carlos whispered, his flashlight beam revealing something that made us both step backward in horror. Hanging from the cave ceiling, suspended by what looked like fishing line and rope, were pieces of human clothing. Jackets, pants, boots, all torn and stained with substances I didn't want to identify. Among them, clearly visible, was a University of Alaska research jacket with DRP Moore embroidered on the chest. "We're leaving," I said, fighting back nausea. "Right now." As we turned to exit the cave, our flashlights illuminated something else that made my heart stop. Fresh footprints led deeper into the cave system, the same elongated clawed prints we'd found around our shelter. But these tracks were accompanied by drag marks, as if something heavy had been pulled into the depths of the cave. We ran from that place, stumbling over rocks and debris in our haste to get back to the relative safety of our camp. The smell of decay clung to our clothes and seemed to follow us across the island. Neither of us spoke during the 3-mile hike back, but I could see in Carlos's eyes the same terrible understanding that was growing in my own mind. We weren't dealing with wild animals or natural phenomena. Something was living in those caves, something that had killed Dr. Moore and God knew who else, something that was now aware of our presence and was methodically stalking us. Back at our shelter, I immediately began working on the emergency beacon while Carlos tried once more to establish radio contact. We'd given up any pretense that this was a routine geological survey. Our only priority now was survival and getting word to the authorities about what we'd discovered. "I'm getting something," Carlos said suddenly, his voice tight with excitement. "Not clear, but someone's transmitting." I rushed over to the radio as he fine-tuned the frequency. Through heavy static, we could hear a voice, male, speaking in what sounded like a mixture of English and another language I couldn't identify. "Day 7 on the island. Supplies running low. They only come out at night. Staying in the bunker during daylight." The transmission was fragmentary, cutting in and out, but the implications were terrifying. Someone else was trapped on the island, and from the sound of it, they'd been here for at least a week. "Hello?" I transmitted. "This is David Crane with a geological survey team. Can you hear me? What's your location?" The response came immediately, clear enough to understand despite the static. Jesus, thank God. I thought I was the only one left. "They got the others 3 days ago. I'm in the old Japanese command bunker on the North Ridge. Whatever you do, don't go near the caves after dark. They come out of there when the sun goes down." My hands were shaking as I keyed the microphone. "Who are they? What happened to your team?" "I don't know what they are," the voice replied, terror evident even through the radio distortion. "They look human from a distance, but when you get close, God, when you get close, you can see they're not human at all. Dr. Moore tried to study them. She thought they might be some kind of undiscovered species. They killed her first." The transmission cut out completely, leaving us in silence that felt heavier than before. Carlos and I stared at each other, both understanding that our worst fears had been confirmed. We weren't alone on the island, and whatever was sharing this place with us had already killed multiple people. "We need to get to whoever that was," I said. "If there's another survivor, we can't leave them." Carlos nodded grimly. "The North Ridge is about 5 miles from here. We could make it before dark if we leave now." As we prepared for what might be our last trek across Kiska Island, I activated our emergency beacon. Somewhere, in an operations center hundreds of miles away, alarms would be sounding and rescue operations would begin mobilizing. But given the remoteness of our location and the weather conditions, help was still at least 24 hours away. 24 hours might as well have been forever. As the afternoon shadows lengthened and the temperature began dropping toward another terrifying night, I realized we would have to face whatever was hiding on Kiska Island long before any rescue could reach us. The radio crackled to life one more time as we shouldered our packs. "They're moving in daylight now. I can see them from the bunker window. God help us all. They're not waiting for dark anymore." Then silence, broken only by the wind and the sound of our own fearful breathing as we set out across the island toward what might be our final destination. The 5-mile trek to the North Ridge took us through the most treacherous terrain on Kiska Island. We had to navigate around deep ravines, climb over collapsed bunkers, and constantly check our compass bearings as the landscape seemed to shift and change around us. The persistent overcast sky made it difficult to judge time, but I estimated we had maybe 3 hours of daylight remaining when we finally spotted the Japanese command bunker. The structure was built into the ridge itself, constructed of reinforced concrete that had withstood decades of Aleutian weather. Most of the building was underground, with only a small observation section visible above ground level. Smoke was rising from a camouflaged chimney, indicating that someone was indeed alive inside. "Hello in the bunker," I called as we approached. "This is David Crane from the Geological Survey team. We're coming in." A section of what looked like solid rock slid aside, revealing a concealed entrance. A man emerged, rifle in hand, scanning the terrain behind us nervously before motioning us inside. He looked like he'd been through hell, unshaven, clothes torn and stained, eyes that darted constantly toward shadows and movement. "Move fast," he said urgently. "They've been watching this place since dawn." Inside the bunker, we found ourselves in a maze of concrete corridors lit by battery-powered lanterns. Our rescuer led us to what had been the command room, now converted into a makeshift living space. 2 other people were there, a woman in her 30s wearing the remains of research gear, and an older man who looked like he might be military or ex-military. "I'm Dr. James Winston," our contact said, finally lowering his rifle. "Marine biology team from the University of Alaska. This is Dr. Sarah Chen, our research assistant, and Captain Ray Morrison, our boat captain." Chen looked up from a laptop computer where she'd been typing frantically. "How many are in your team?" she asked. "Just the 2 of us," I replied. "David Crane and Carlos Rodriguez, Geological Survey for North Point Mining." Morrison, who'd been watching the entrance through a periscope system, turned to face us. "Then you're the lucky ones. Every other team that's come to this island in the past month has been wiped out." "Every other team?" Carlos asked. "How many people are we talking about?" Winston pulled out a notebook filled with names and dates. "Dr. Moore's marine biology expedition, 6 people. A team from the National Weather Service, 4 people. Some kind of military reconnaissance group, at least 8 soldiers. All dead." Chen looked up from her computer. "We think we know what happened to them. We've been documenting everything, hoping someone would eventually find this record." She turned the laptop screen toward us, revealing dozens of photographs and video files. The images were horrifying. They showed the caves we'd visited earlier, but from deeper inside the system where we hadn't dared to go. Bodies were visible in the photographs, or what remained of bodies, but the most disturbing images showed the things that had killed them. They looked human at first glance, but the closer examination revealed the terrible differences. Elongated limbs, oversized hands ending in claws, faces that were almost but not quite human. Their skin appeared gray and mottled, and their movements in the video footage were wrong. Too quick, too fluid, like predators, rather than people. "What are they?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "We think they're human," Winston replied grimly, "or they were human once. The bunker records we found indicate that during the Japanese occupation, there were experiments conducted in those caves, biological experiments on prisoners of war." Chen pulled up another file on her computer, scanned documents in both Japanese and English. The translations are rough, but it appears they were testing the effects of various chemical and biological agents on human subjects. The goal was to create enhanced soldiers, stronger, faster, more aggressive. "Jesus," Carlos breathed. "And these things are the result?" Morrison nodded. "The experiments were abandoned when the Americans invaded, but apparently some of the subjects survived in the cave system. They've been living down there for over 80 years, breeding, evolving, becoming something that's no longer quite human." "But why are they killing researchers now?" I asked, "if they've been here all this time?" "Climate change," Chen explained. "The cave system is connected to the ocean through underwater passages. Rising sea levels and changing currents have been flooding their habitat. They're being forced out, and they see anyone on the surface as competition for territory. A metallic clang echoed through the bunker, followed by the sound of something scratching against the concealed entrance. Morrison immediately moved to the periscope while Winston picked up his rifle. "They're here," Morrison reported quietly. "I count at least 6 of them, moving around the entrance." Through the periscope eyepiece, I could see them clearly for the first time. They moved in coordinated patterns, communicating through a series of clicks and whistles that sounded disturbingly like human speech. Their intelligence was obvious. They were probing for weaknesses in our defenses, testing different approaches to the bunker entrance. "How long can we hold out here?" Carlos asked. "Supplies for maybe 3 more days," Winston replied. "But that's not our biggest problem. Look at this." He led us to another section of the bunker where seawater was seeping through cracks in the concrete walls. The water level had risen noticeably even since we'd arrived, and the rate of increase was accelerating. "High tide hits in about 6 hours, Morrison explained. "This whole lower section will be flooded. We've been moving equipment and supplies to higher levels, but we're running out of space." Chen showed us tide charts on her computer. "The pattern's been getting worse each day. Tonight's tide will be the highest yet. We estimate the water will reach the main command room level." The terrible reality of our situation was becoming clear. We were trapped between the creatures stalking us outside and the rising water that would eventually force us from our shelter. Even if rescue teams were mobilizing, they wouldn't reach us before we'd have to abandon the bunker. "There's something else," Winston said hesitantly. "We've been monitoring radio transmissions from the creatures. They're not just animals, they're organized and they're learning. They know about our radio communications, our schedules, even our emergency protocols." "What do you mean?" I asked. Chen played an audio file through the computer speakers. It was a radio transmission, but the voice was wrong. Human words spoken with inhuman vocal cords, pronunciation that was almost but not quite right. "Rescue team, coordinates, North Ridge bunker. All teams respond." My blood turned cold as I recognized the transmission. It was our emergency beacon signal, being mimicked and broadcast by the creatures to confuse any rescue attempts. "They're using our own communications against us," Morrison said grimly. "Any rescue team that responds to those false signals will be walking into an ambush." Another sound echoed through the bunker, metal being systematically torn apart. The creatures had found the ventilation shafts and were methodically dismantling our air supply. "We have maybe 2 hours before the air in here becomes unbreathable," Winston reported after checking the atmospheric monitors. "Combined with the flooding, we'll be forced out well before dawn." As if summoned by our desperation, the radio crackled to life with an incoming transmission. But this time, the voice was clearly human and speaking with the clipped professionalism of military communications. "This is Coast Guard Rescue Helicopter Kodiak 7. We have emergency beacon signals from Kiska Island. Any survivors, please respond on this frequency." I grabbed the microphone, but Winston stopped me. "Wait," he said. "Listen to the background noise." He was right. Behind the professional-sounding voice, I could hear the same clicking and whistling sounds we'd identified as creature communication. The transmission was another fake, another trap. "They're getting smarter," Chen said quietly. "Learning our language, our procedures. Each transmission is more convincing than the last." Outside, the sounds of tearing metal intensified. The creatures were no longer content to wait. They were actively working to break into our shelter, and time was running out faster than any of us had anticipated. "There's one more thing you need to know," Winston said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Dr. Moore's research notes indicate that these things don't just kill for food or territory. They're taking prisoners, bringing some people back to the caves alive." The implication hung in the air like a physical weight. Somewhere in those caves there might be survivors, people being kept alive for purposes we didn't want to imagine. As the water continued rising and the sounds of destruction grew louder, I realized that our choices had been reduced to 2 equally horrifying options: face the creatures outside and almost certain death, or wait for the bunker to flood and definitely drown. Either way, Our time on Kiska Island was measured in hours, not days. The water reached our ankles as we gathered in the highest section of the bunker, a small observation room that offered a panoramic view of the island through reinforced windows. What we saw outside made our desperate situation even worse. The creatures weren't just surrounding the bunker, they were everywhere. Dozens of them moved across the landscape in organized groups, some carrying what looked like tools or weapons fashioned from scavenged military equipment. "My God," Chen whispered, pointing toward the caves. "Look at how many there are." A steady stream of the creatures was emerging from the cave system, far more than any of us had imagined. They moved with purpose, not random hunting behavior, but coordinated tactical deployment. Some groups were positioning themselves along potential escape routes while others worked to breach our defenses. Morrison was monitoring multiple radio frequencies, documenting the false transmissions being broadcast by the creatures. "They're jamming everything," he reported. "Every emergency frequency, every rescue channel. Even if legitimate help is coming, they won't be able to coordinate with us." The metallic tearing sounds had stopped, replaced by something worse: silence. The creatures had finished their work on the ventilation system, and the air in the bunker was already becoming stale and oppressive. "Oxygen levels are dropping faster than projected," Winston announced after checking his instruments. "We have maybe 90 minutes before breathing becomes dangerous, less if we're physically active." Carlos was examining structural blueprints of the bunker, looking for any escape route we might have missed. "There's a tunnel system connecting to the old ammunition storage," he said. "But according to these plans, it's designed to flood during high tide to prevent explosions." "How long until high tide peaks?" I asked. Chen checked her charts. 47 minutes. The tunnel will be completely underwater by then." A new sound interrupted our planning, rhythmic hammering that seemed to come from directly above us. The creatures had found the main entrance and were systematically breaking through the concrete barriers that had protected the bunker for decades. "How long will those barriers hold?" Morrison asked. Winston shook his head grimly. "They weren't designed to withstand this kind of assault. Maybe 20 minutes, probably less. I made a decision that I knew might kill us all, but staying meant certain death anyway. We're going into the tunnel system. Even if it's flooded, we might find air pockets or alternative exits." "That's suicide," Chen protested. "The tunnel leads directly toward the cave system where those things are coming from." "Everything's suicide at this point," Carlos replied, already gathering essential equipment. "At least this way we're moving instead of waiting to die." We quickly assembled emergency supplies: waterproof containers with our documentation, diving masks, and improvised breathing equipment, weapons, and the strongest flashlights we had. Every piece of equipment might mean the difference between life and death in the flooded tunnels. The hammering above us intensified, accompanied by new sounds: concrete cracking and metal bending. Dust and debris began falling from the ceiling as the creatures broke through the outer defenses. "They're in the upper levels," Morrison reported, tracking their progress through the bunker's internal sensor system. "Moving fast, like they know exactly where they're going." Winston led us to the tunnel entrance, a heavy steel door marked with warning signs in Japanese and English. When he opened it, we were hit with the smell of seawater and decay. The tunnel stretched into darkness, ankle-deep water already covering the floor. "Stay together," I instructed as we entered the tunnel. "Document everything we see. If we don't make it out, maybe this record will help the next team." The tunnel was narrow, forcing us to move in single file through increasingly deep water. Our flashlights revealed concrete walls covered with strange markings. Not the random scratches we'd seen elsewhere, but deliberate patterns that looked almost like writing or mathematical equations. "These markings," Chen said, photographing them as we moved. "They're not Japanese or English. The patterns are too complex, too systematic." "The creatures made these," Winston replied. "We found similar markings in the cave system. They've developed their own written language." The water was rising faster than we'd anticipated, now reaching our knees and making movement difficult. But more disturbing were the sounds echoing through the tunnel, Not just the creatures behind us in the bunker, but new sounds from ahead, coming from the direction we were traveling. "There's something in the water," Carlos said, his flashlight beam catching movement in the murky liquid ahead of us. We stopped, listening to sounds that made my skin crawl, splashing as if large objects were moving through the flooded sections of the tunnel. The creatures weren't just on land. Some of them were adapted for aquatic movement. "Back up slowly," Morrison whispered. "Don't make any sudden movements." But it was too late. The water around our legs began churning as something large approached from both directions. We were trapped in a narrow tunnel, with creatures ahead of us, behind us, and the water level rising by the minute. "The air pocket," Chen said suddenly, pointing her flashlight toward the ceiling. "There's a maintenance shaft about 20 feet ahead." We moved as quickly as we could through the deepening water, feeling things brush against our legs in the darkness. The shaft Chen had spotted was just large enough for one person at a time, extending upward into the bedrock above the tunnel. "I'll go first," I said, boosting myself up into the shaft. The metal rungs were slippery with condensation, but they held my weight. Above me, the shaft extended into complete darkness. One by one, we climbed into the maintenance shaft as the water in the tunnel rose to dangerous levels. Behind us, we could hear the creatures entering the flooded passage, their inhuman voices echoing off the concrete walls as they searched for us. The shaft led to a small chamber carved out of the natural rock, apparently used for equipment storage during the bunker's construction. It was dry, but barely large enough for all 5 of us, and the air was thin and stale. "We can't stay here long," Winston said, checking his oxygen meter. "This chamber isn't ventilated." Chen was examining the walls of the chamber with her flashlight. "There are more markings here," she said, "but these are different. Older, more primitive." The markings she'd found weren't the systematic patterns we'd seen in the tunnel. These looked more like desperate scratches, as if someone had been trapped here and had tried to record something important before dying. "Can you read any of it?" I asked. "Some of it's in English," Chen replied, her voice shaking. "It says Day 12, air running out. They know we're here. God forgive us for what we created." The implications were horrifying. This chamber had been used before, by someone who understood what the creatures were and felt responsible for their existence. Probably scientists involved in the original experiments who had tried to hide from their own creations. A sound from below made us all freeze, metal clanging against metal, as if something was climbing the maintenance shaft. The creatures had found our escape route and were following us into the chamber. "There's got to be another way out," Morrison said desperately, examining every surface of the small room. Carlos found it, a crack in the wall barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. Beyond the crack, his flashlight revealed a natural cave passage that seemed to extend horizontally through the bedrock. "It's a tight fit," he reported, "but it might connect to other parts of the cave system." The sounds from the shaft were getting closer. We had seconds to make another life or death decision. "Through the crack," I ordered. "Whatever's on the other side can't be worse than what's coming up that shaft." We squeezed through the narrow opening one at a time, emerging into a natural cave that felt different from anything we'd encountered before. The air was fresher, and there was a faint sound of moving water somewhere in the distance. But as our flashlights illuminated the cave walls, we discovered something that made our blood freeze. The walls were covered with human remains, not scattered bones like we'd seen before, but complete skeletons arranged in deliberate patterns. And carved into the rock above them were dates spanning 8 decades, marking each group of victims like a monstrous calendar. The most recent date was only 3 days old. We were standing in their trophy room, surrounded by the evidence of 80 years of systematic killing. And somewhere in the darkness beyond our flashlight beams, we could hear movement. Slow, deliberate footsteps approaching from multiple directions. We had found the heart of their territory, and there was nowhere left to run. The trophy chamber extended far beyond what our flashlights could illuminate, filled with the remains of decades of victims arranged in grotesque displays. Each skeleton was positioned deliberately, creating a macabre museum of death that spoke to the creature's intelligence and their systematic approach to killing. Jesus Christ, Morrison whispered, his light falling on a display that included military uniforms, research equipment, and personal belongings arranged around the bones like offerings. Don't use that name, Chen said sharply. These things might understand English. We can't afford to give them any more information about us. She was right. The markings we'd seen suggested the creatures had been learning from their victims, absorbing language, culture, and knowledge with each kill. Every word we spoke in their presence made them more dangerous. Winston was documenting the displays with his camera, his professional training overriding his terror. The arrangement patterns, he said quietly. They're organizing victims by type. Military here, scientists there, civilians in another section. They're cataloging us. The sound of movement in the darkness was getting closer, accompanied by the clicking communication we'd heard before. But now we could hear individual voices in the darkness. Human words spoken with inhuman inflection, fragments of conversations learned from previous victims. "Help me, please help me," came a voice from the shadows, perfectly mimicking human distress. "Don't respond," I warned the others. "They're using recorded speech patterns to lure us deeper into their territory." But Carlos had frozen, his flashlight beam fixed on something that made him stagger backward. "That voice," he said. "I know that voice." Following his light, we saw a fresh addition to the trophy chamber, Dr. Moore's research station, complete with her equipment, notes, and personal belongings. But arranged around it were audio recording devices that were playing back her final moments. "Day 6 on Kiska Island," Dr. Moore's recorded voice echoed through the cave. "I've made contact with what appears to be an isolated human population. They seem primitive but intelligent. I'm going to attempt communication." The recording continued, documenting her growing realization that she'd encountered something far more dangerous than an undiscovered tribe. Her final entries were filled with terror as she understood what was happening to her team. "They're not human," her voice said through the speakers. "They're learning from us, copying our speech, our behavior. They've been studying us since we arrived. God help me. I think they're going to keep me alive to learn more." The recording cut off, replaced by inhuman voices practicing human speech patterns, repeating Dr. Moore's words with increasing accuracy. They had been using her as a language teacher, forcing her to help them perfect their mimicry before killing her. "They're all around us," Morrison reported, scanning the darkness with his rifle. "At least a dozen, maybe more. They're staying at the edge of our light, but they're definitely there. I could see them too, shapes that moved wrong, shadows that didn't match the cave formations, the occasional glint of eyes reflecting our flashlight beams. They were surrounding us slowly, methodically, like predators ensuring their prey couldn't escape." "The water sound," Chen said suddenly. "There's an underground stream somewhere near here. If we can find it, we might be able to follow it out of the cave system." It was a desperate plan, but it was the only option we had. The alternative was to wait for the creatures to close their trap, and we'd already seen what happened to people who were captured alive. "Move toward the sound," I instructed. "Stay together, keep your lights up, and don't respond to anything they say, no matter how human it sounds." We began moving deeper into the cave, stepping carefully around the displays of human remains. The creatures paralleled our movement, staying just beyond our vision, but making enough noise to remind us of their presence. They were herding us, I realized, guiding us toward something specific. The sound of water grew stronger as we progressed, but so did evidence of the creatures' activities. We passed workshops where they had fashioned tools from scavenged metal, sleeping areas lined with materials taken from their victims, and storage chambers filled with supplies systematically looted from every expedition that had come to the island. "They're completely self-sufficient," Winston observed. "They've built an entire civilization down here using knowledge stolen from their victims." "How many of them are there?" Carlos asked. Chen had been studying the living areas we'd passed. "Based on the size of these spaces, I'd estimate at least 50, maybe more. Multiple generations living in an organized society." The full scope of what we were facing became clear. This wasn't a pack of animals or even a group of survivors from failed experiments. This was a functioning civilization that had evolved over 8 decades. learning from every human they encountered, growing more sophisticated with each generation. "The stream," Morrison said, his light catching the reflection of moving water. "About 30 yards ahead." The underground stream was larger than expected, flowing through a natural channel carved into the bedrock. The water was clear and fast-moving, disappearing into a tunnel that might lead to the ocean or might lead deeper into the island's interior. "It's too narrow for the creatures to follow," Chen observed, "but also too narrow for us if we're carrying equipment." As if responding to her words, voices began calling from the darkness around us. Not the creatures' voices, but human voices. Some we recognized from the recordings. "Don't leave us here," came Dr. Moore's voice. "Please, we're still alive. They keep us alive to teach them." "It's not real," I said firmly, though the voices were so convincing that part of me wanted to respond. "Keep moving toward the water." But then another voice called out, one that made my heart stop. "David, David, is that you? It's Peterson, your helicopter pilot. My bird went down. I've been hiding in these caves for days." The voice was perfect. Peterson's distinctive gravelly tone, his military bearing evident even in distress. If I hadn't known with absolute certainty that Peterson was scheduled to return to the island the next morning, I might have believed it. "They recorded him too," Carlos said grimly. "Probably when he dropped us off. They've been learning our voices, our relationships, everything they need to manipulate us." The creatures were getting bolder now, their shapes becoming visible at the edge of our flashlight beams. Up close, they were even more disturbing than the photographs had suggested. Human-like but wrong in subtle ways that triggered every instinct to run. Their movements were too fluid, their proportions slightly off, their eyes reflecting light like animals rather than people. "Into the water," I ordered. "Now." We waded into the underground stream, the current immediately pulling at our legs. The water was shockingly cold, but clean and oxygenated. Behind us, the creatures had moved into our abandoned light, examining our equipment and speaking in their human voices. "They'll follow us," Winston said as we were swept into the narrow tunnel. "They know this cave system better than we do." He was right. Even as the current carried us away from the trophy chamber, we could hear splashing behind us, accompanied by the distinctive clicking communication that meant they were coordinating pursuit. The tunnel twisted and branched, forcing us to make split-second decisions about which passage to follow. Some led to dead ends, others to chambers filled with stagnant water. But always, behind us, we could hear them coming. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, we saw light ahead. Not electric light, but the gray illumination of daylight filtering through water. The stream was leading to the ocean, but the final section was completely submerged. "We'll have to dive," Morrison said. "Hold your breath and follow the current. If this connects to the ocean, we might surface outside the cave system." One by one, we took deep breaths and disappeared beneath the surface, trusting the current to carry us to safety. Behind us, the creatures reached the water barrier, their inhuman voices echoing through the submerged tunnel as they realized their prey was escaping. But escape was a relative term. Even if we survived the underwater passage, we would still be on Kiska Island, surrounded by an organized population of killers who knew the terrain better than we did and had spent 80 years perfecting the art of hunting humans. The current pulled us deeper into darkness, and I wondered if we were swimming toward freedom or simply drowning in a different part of their domain. I broke the surface, gasping, my lungs burning as I sucked in the cold Aleutian air. The underground stream had carried us through a submerged passage and ejected us into a tidal pool on Kiska Island's eastern shore. One by one, the others surfaced around me, Winston first, then Chen, Morrison, and finally Carlos, who emerged coughing up seawater but alive. We dragged ourselves onto the rocky shore, shivering and exhausted. The gray daylight felt like a blessing after the darkness of the caves, but it also made us visible to anything watching from the island's interior. "Everyone accounted for?" I called, doing a quick head count as we huddled in the shelter of some large boulders. "Present," came the responses, though we were all showing signs of hypothermia and exhaustion. How far are we from the original landing site? Carlos asked, trying to orient himself using the distant ridgelines. Morrison checked his waterproof compass. Maybe 3 miles southeast. If Peterson's still planning to extract us tomorrow morning, we need to get back to that location. Assuming Peterson is actually coming, Chen said grimly. For all we know, those things have been broadcasting false confirmations using his voice. The implications were terrifying. If the creatures had compromised our communication with the outside world, we might be completely cut off with no rescue coming. Even worse, any legitimate rescue attempt might be walking into the same trap that had killed Dr. Moore's team and the others. We need to reach higher ground, Winston said, scanning the terrain with his binoculars. Get a clear view of the island and try to establish some kind of signal to legitimate rescue teams. The climb inland from the tidal pool was treacherous, requiring us to navigate across slippery rocks and through patches of unstable scree. But the elevation gave us our first comprehensive view of Kiska Island since arriving, and what we saw was disturbing. Jesus, Morrison breathed, adjusting the focus on his binoculars. The island was active in ways we hadn't noticed before. Small groups of the creatures were moving systematically across the landscape, examining areas where helicopters might land, positioning themselves near potential rescue sites. They weren't just hunting randomly, they were preparing for the arrival of rescue teams. They know our extraction protocol, Chen realized. Dr. Moore's expedition would have followed the same procedures we did. They've learned our standard operating procedures. Through the binoculars, I could see creatures near our original landing site, some of them wearing pieces of military equipment taken from previous victims. They had fashioned crude but effective camouflage, making them nearly invisible until they moved. There, Carlos pointed toward a ridge about 2 miles north of our position. That's the highest point on the island. If we can get there, we might be able to signal aircraft or ships that aren't part of their communications trap. The hike to the ridge would take us across open ground where we'd be visible to the creatures below, but staying in our current position meant certain death once they organized a search for us. We had to take the risk. Stay low, move fast, and don't stop for anything, I instructed as we began our ascent. The terrain worked in our favor initially, providing natural cover as we climbed through a series of gullies and rock formations. But as we gained elevation, the vegetation thinned and the cover disappeared, leaving us exposed on the barren slopes. Movement below, Morrison reported, glass fixed on the landscape behind us. They've found our trail from the tidal pool, at least 8 of them, moving fast. We increased our pace, but the creatures were adapted to this terrain in ways we weren't. They moved across the rocky ground with fluid efficiency, covering distance at a pace we couldn't match while carrying our equipment. They're going to catch us before we reach the ridge, Chen said, breathing hard from the climb. No, they're not, Winston replied grimly. He had stopped climbing and was unpacking something from his waterproof case, explosive charges he'd brought for geological sampling. Keep going. I'll slow them down. You can't stay behind, I protested. They'll kill you. They'll kill all of us if they catch us before we can signal for help, Winston replied, already placing charges along the slope below our position. Get to that ridge and find a way to contact the outside world. Tell them what's really happening on this island. There was no time to argue. The creatures were less than half a mile behind us and closing fast. We left Winston to his desperate plan and continued climbing toward the ridge, each step taking us higher above the desolate landscape of Kiska Island. The explosion, when it came, was larger than expected. Winston had used all his charges at once, triggering a rock slide that temporarily blocked the slope behind us. Through the dust and debris, we could see him climbing frantically to catch up, but we could also see the creatures already working to clear the obstacle. He bought us maybe 10 minutes, Morrison estimated. Better make them count. The final approach to the ridge was nearly vertical, requiring us to use climbing techniques on loose rock that threatened to give way with each handhold. But finally, we reached the summit, a narrow, windswept peak that offered a panoramic view of Kiska Island and the surrounding ocean. There, Chen pointed toward the eastern horizon. Ship's smoke. Through the binoculars, I could see a Coast Guard cutter moving through the swells about 10 miles offshore. It was too far to signal with flashlights, but Morrison had an emergency flare gun in his pack. "One shot," he said, loading the device. "If this doesn't work, we're out of options." The flare arced high into the gray sky, burning bright red against the overcast clouds. For a moment, we held our breath, watching the distant ship through binoculars. "They're turning," Carlos reported excitedly. "The ship's changing course toward the island." But our celebration was short-lived. Winston reached the ridge just as the creatures crested the slope below us, moving with terrifying determination. He was wounded, blood staining his jacket, but still mobile. "They're not just following us," he gasped as he collapsed beside us. "They're coordinating with others. I saw signals, light flashes from different parts of the island. They're organized like a military unit." The creatures had indeed spread across the island, taking positions that would allow them to ambush any rescue attempt. As we watched, they began signaling to each other using reflected sunlight, coordinating their positions for maximum effectiveness. "The Coast Guard ship will be here in maybe an hour," Morrison estimated. "But if it follows standard rescue protocols, those things will be ready for them." "We need to warn them," I said, working frantically with our emergency radio. "There has to be some way to establish contact." Chen was studying the creature's movements through binoculars. "They're not just positioning for an ambush," she said. "Look at the ones near the landing site. They're setting up something that looks like a signal device." She was right. The creatures had arranged pieces of metal and equipment in patterns that would be visible from aircraft, what appeared to be standard distress signals that would lure rescue teams into landing zones they controlled. "They're using our own procedures against us," Winston said bitterly. "Everything we've taught them about human behavior, they're turning into weapons." The radio crackled to life with an incoming transmission, but the voice that came through the static made our blood freeze. "Coast Guard vessel, this is Dr. David Crane Geological Survey Team. We have survivors on Kiska Island requiring immediate evacuation. Landing zone coordinates follows." One of the creatures was broadcasting using my voice, perfectly mimicked, providing coordinates that would lead the rescue ship directly into their trap. I grabbed the microphone, desperately trying to override the false transmission. "Coast Guard vessel, this is the real David Crane. Do not land at the provided coordinates. The island is compromised. Repeat, do not land." But the response confirmed our worst fears. "Dr. Crane, we're receiving conflicting transmissions. Please confirm your identity and location." The creatures had learned to mimic not just our voices, but our communication protocols. To the Coast Guard, both transmissions would sound equally legitimate. They had no way to distinguish between the real rescue request and the trap. "They're going to land right in the middle of that ambush," Morrison said grimly. "And there's nothing we can do to stop it." As we watched helplessly from the ridge, the Coast Guard cutter approached Kiska Island, heading directly toward coordinates provided by creatures that had spent 80 years perfecting the art of killing humans. In less than an hour, more people would die, and the cycle of violence that had begun with wartime experiments would claim another group of victims. The wind picked up, carrying with it the sound of helicopter rotors. Multiple aircraft were approaching the island, responding to what they believed was a routine rescue operation. "We have to do something," Chen said desperately. "We can't just watch them die." But from our position on the ridge, surrounded by creatures that knew the terrain better than we did and armed with knowledge stolen from decades of victims, our options were limited to watching and hoping that somehow the approaching rescue teams would survive their encounter with the hidden civilization of Kiska Island. The sound of approaching helicopters grew louder as 2 Coast Guard aircraft materialized through the overcast sky. From our position on the ridge, we could see the creatures positioning themselves around the false landing zone they had created, using equipment and signals stolen from previous expeditions to create what appeared to be a legitimate rescue site. "We have to warn them," I said, working frantically with our radio equipment. "There has to be some frequency they're not monitoring." Winston, despite his wounds, was scanning through emergency channels. "Try the international distress frequency," he suggested. "Most of these creatures learned English from American researchers. They might not monitor international channels." I switched frequencies and began broadcasting in Spanish, hoping that at least one of the Coast Guard pilots would understand. Helicópteros de guardacostas, peligro en la isla. No aterricen en las coordenadas transmitidas. La isla está comprometida. The response came immediately in accented but clear English. This is Coast Guard Rescue Team Leader Captain Rodriguez. Who is this, and what is the nature of the danger? Captain, this is Dr. David Crane, the real Geological Survey Team Leader, I replied, switching back to English. The coordinates being transmitted are a trap. The island is inhabited by hostile entities that have been killing research teams for months. A pause then. Dr. Crane, we're receiving contradictory information. Can you provide authentication codes? I gave him our legitimate mission codes, praying they would distinguish us from the creature's transmissions. Through our binoculars, we could see the helicopters circling the island, maintaining altitude while they attempted to sort out the conflicting information. Authentication confirmed, Rodriguez replied. What exactly are we dealing with down there? Chen grabbed the microphone. Captain, this is Dr. Sarah Chen, Marine Biology Team. We have documented evidence of an organized population of hostile entities living in the cave systems. They've been systematically killing researchers and learning from them. They know our rescue protocols and are using that knowledge to set traps. Roger that, Dr. Chen. Can you guide us to a safe landing zone? Morrison was already studying the terrain through his binoculars. The north end of the island, he transmitted. About 2 kilometers from the false coordinates, rocky terrain, but it looks clear of hostiles. Copy. We're proceeding to alternate landing zone. All survivors maintain your current position until we can establish secure perimeter. But as the helicopters changed course toward the safer landing zone, the creatures below began adapting their strategy. We watched in horror as they abandoned their original ambush site and began moving rapidly across the island toward the new coordinates. They're following the helicopters, Carlos observed. They can track aircraft movement and adjust their positions accordingly. How fast can those things move? Morrison asked. Winston consulted his field notes from our encounters. Faster than humans across this terrain. If the helicopters take more than 10 minutes to land and establish security, the creatures will be in position to attack. I transmitted this information to Captain Rodriguez, who immediately altered his approach. Instead of landing immediately, the helicopters began orbiting the area, while crew members used optical equipment to scan for threats. We're seeing movement on the ground, Rodriguez reported. Multiple contacts moving toward the LZ. This is unlike anything in our threat assessment databases. Because they've never been properly documented, Chen replied. Every team that's encountered them has been killed. We're the first survivors to maintain contact with rescue operations. What followed was unlike any rescue operation any of us had experienced. Instead of a routine extraction, the Coast Guard team treated our situation like a combat zone. They established overwatch positions with armed crew members while landing to evacuate us, maintaining constant communication to monitor for threats. The first helicopter touched down about 500 yards from our ridge position, but before we could begin moving toward it, Winston spotted movement that made our blood freeze. They're coming up the slope behind us, he reported. At least 6 of them moving fast. We were trapped between the approaching creatures and a 500-yard dash across open ground to reach the helicopter. Even worse, more creatures were emerging from concealed positions around the landing zone, moving to surround the aircraft. Coast Guard team, you have hostiles approaching your perimeter, I transmitted urgently. Multiple contacts, moving to surround your position. Captain Rodriguez's response was immediate and professional. Roger that. We have visual on the contacts, maintaining security posture. Through our binoculars, we could see Coast Guard crew members taking defensive positions around their aircraft while maintaining evacuation readiness. But as the creatures got closer, it became clear that conventional military tactics might not be effective against entities that had spent 80 years learning to hunt humans. They're not attacking directly, Morrison observed. They're positioning for something else. He was right. Instead of charging the helicopter, the creatures were taking positions that would allow them to cut off any escape route. They had learned patience and strategy from their victims, turning human tactical knowledge against the rescuers. We need a distraction, I said. Something to draw them away from the helicopter long enough for us to reach it. Carlos was examining our remaining equipment. "The emergency flares," he said. "If we can create multiple ignition points around the island, it might confuse them long enough for extraction." It was our last desperate option. We divided our remaining flares among the team, planning to create maximum confusion by triggering them simultaneously from different positions. "On my signal," I instructed. 3, 2, 1, mark." Red flares erupted across the ridge, creating multiple bright points of light that temporarily blinded anyone watching. In the confusion, we began our sprint toward the helicopter, running across terrain that offered no cover while creatures converged on our position from multiple directions. "Coast Guard team, survivors inbound to your position," I transmitted while running. "Prepare for immediate extraction." The helicopter crew had anticipated our approach and were already spinning up for takeoff. But as we reached the halfway point, the creatures emerged from their concealment, moving with inhuman speed to intercept us. "Contact," Rodriguez's voice came through the radio. "Engaging hostiles." What followed was surreal. A firefight between professional military personnel and entities that moved like humans, but weren't quite human. The creatures used cover and tactical movement, but their inhuman agility allowed them to advance despite the gunfire. "Move, move, move!" came the shouts from the helicopter as we covered the final distance. One by one, we were hauled aboard while the aircraft lifted off, climbing rapidly away from the island. But our escape came at a cost. As the helicopter gained altitude, we could see Coast Guard personnel on the ground still fighting to reach the second aircraft. Not everyone was going to make it out. "We have to go back," Chen said desperately. "There are still people down there." Captain Rodriguez was coordinating with his ground team through headset communications. "Negative. We've lost contact with the ground element. They're on their own until we can organize a larger response." As Kiska Island fell away beneath us, I made one final transmission on the emergency frequency. "This is Dr. David Crane to any station. Kiska Island is a red zone. Multiple casualties confirmed. Do not attempt landing without full military support. Recommend immediate quarantine of the area until proper response can be organized." The response came from Coast Guard operations in Dutch Harbor. "Message received and logged. Investigation team being assembled. All civilian aircraft are hereby prohibited from approaching Kiska Island until further notice." We had survived, but the cost was devastating. The creatures were still on the island, still learning, still killing anyone who came within their reach. Our geological survey had uncovered something far worse than mineral deposits. We had documented the existence of a civilization built on 8 decades of systematically hunting and killing human beings. As the helicopter carried us toward safety, I looked back at Kiska Island one last time. Somewhere in those caves, the creatures were examining the equipment left behind by the Coast Guard team, learning new things about human technology and tactics. They would be ready for the next group of people who came to the island. And despite our warnings, despite our documentation, despite everything we had witnessed, I knew that people would continue to come. The lure of scientific discovery, military investigation, or simple human curiosity would draw more victims to Kiska Island. The creatures would be waiting for them, as they had waited for us, as they had waited for Dr. Moore and all the others whose bones now decorated their underground chambers. Something was indeed hiding on one of Alaska's remote islands, and now the outside world finally knew it existed. But knowing about the danger and stopping it were two very different things. The radio crackled to life one final time as we flew toward the mainland, and the voice that came through the static was unmistakably human, but with an inflection that made my skin crawl. "Thank you for the education, Dr. Crane. We look forward to meeting the next group of teachers you send us." Then silence, broken only by the sound of helicopter rotors carrying us away from a place where humanity had created something that would hunt us for generations to come. In my final report, I recommended that Kiska Island be designated a permanent exclusion zone, off limits to all human activity. But I know that somewhere in government offices and research institutions, people are already planning new expeditions, convinced they can succeed where we failed. The creatures on Kiska Island are patient. They have learned that lesson well from their 8 decades of experience. They can wait.
The smell of microwave popcorn filled Jade's apartment as I settled onto her plush couch, wrapped in the throw blanket I'd claimed as my own over years of friendship. It was October 2022, and at 28, I found these quiet nights increasingly precious as adult responsibilities consumed more of our lives. Her apartment was cozy despite its disorganization. String lights illuminated stacks of books and half-finished craft projects, while photos of our college adventures covered nearly every wall space. "I've missed this," I said, watching her arrange snacks on the coffee table. "Work has been absolute torture lately." Jade nodded as she poured wine into mismatched glasses. "Tell me about it. The promotion sounds great until you're drowning in spreadsheets at midnight." We hadn't seen each other in nearly 2 months, our longest gap since becoming friends in freshman year. The plan was simple: comfort food, nostalgic movies, and absolutely no discussion of our professional lives. Her apartment perfectly reflected her personality, chaotic but inviting. Empty coffee mugs collected on bookshelves beside carefully tended plants, and her collection of vintage movie posters gave the space a unique charm. "I cleaned for 3 hours before you got here," she confessed, noticing my glance at the scattered magazines. "This is actually the presentable version." I laughed. "You should see my place. I'm pretty sure something's evolving in my refrigerator at this point." As Jade scrolled through streaming options, I sank deeper into the couch. The familiar comfort of our friendship temporarily masked the exhaustion that had been my constant companion for weeks. Outside, rain began to tap against the windows, creating the perfect backdrop for our evening. "So dinner," Jade announced, putting down the remote. "I was thinking pizza. That place on Westmore that we used to love just started delivering to this neighborhood." "Perfect," I agreed, already imagining the garlic knots that had sustained us through countless study sessions. "My treat this time." Jade hesitated slightly, her fingers hovering over her phone. "Actually, I've got this guy who might be bringing it over." She caught my expression and quickly added, "Not like that. He's just... well, you'll see. His name is Gordon. He helps me out sometimes." I raised an eyebrow. "Helps you out? That sounds suspiciously like you've acquired a personal assistant." "It's not like that," she insisted, though her tone suggested otherwise. "He's just really helpful." Little did I understand the true meaning behind her words, or how significantly this helpful stranger would alter the course of our lives. When the doorbell rang 40 minutes later, Jade jumped up with unexpected nervousness. "That'll be Gordon with the food," she said, smoothing her sweatpants as if suddenly self-conscious about her appearance. "Just the delivery guy," I mumbled, slightly annoyed at the interruption to our evening. I had assumed we'd be alone. The man who entered carried more than just pizza boxes. An immediate atmosphere of awkwardness followed him into the room, tall, thin, with darting eyes that never quite settled on anything. He appeared to be in his early 30s, dressed in a neatly pressed button-down shirt that seemed oddly formal for delivering food. "Hi, Gordon," Jade greeted him with excessive warmth. "Thanks so much for doing this." "No problem at all," he replied, his voice softer than his frame would suggest. He placed the boxes on the counter with careful precision. "I got extra napkins like you asked, and those breadsticks from the place across town that you mentioned last week." I noticed he'd brought items from 2 different restaurants, a detail that struck me as strange for ordinary delivery. "Gordon, this is my friend," Jade introduced us. "We've known each other since college." His eyes finally connected with mine, and I felt a strange sensation, like being examined rather than seen. "Nice to meet you," he said, extending a hand that was unexpectedly cold. "Likewise," I responded automatically, discomfort building as he held the handshake several seconds too long. "Gordon has been amazingly helpful since I moved to this neighborhood," Jade explained, her tone suggesting she wanted me to approve of him. "He knows everyone and everything around here." Gordon's posture changed subtly at the praise, standing straighter as a hint of smile formed. "Just trying to be neighborly." The conversation stalled into uncomfortable silence before Gordon suddenly asked, "Do you live nearby too?" Before I could formulate a vague answer, Jade supplied, "She's over on Riverview, in those new apartments." I shot her a look of betrayal as Gordon nodded, mentally filing away this information. That's a nice area. Great running trails behind those buildings. The implication that he knew my neighborhood in detail made me uneasy. Maybe we could exchange numbers, he suggested, phone already in hand, in case you ever need anything delivered, or help with, well, anything at all. With Jade watching expectantly, I reluctantly recited my number, which Gordon saved with meticulous attention. Well, I should let you enjoy your evening, he finally said, though he made no immediate move toward the door. Thanks again, Gordon. Drive safe, Jade prompted, finally giving him the cue to leave. When the door closed behind him, I turned to Jade with widened eyes. What was that about? She busied herself with the pizza boxes. He's just really helpful. Picks up groceries, does errands. It started when I needed help moving a bookshelf, and now he's your unpaid servant who knows where I live, I finished. He's harmless, she insisted. Just lonely, I think. No social skills, but desperately wants friends. As we settled back with our food, I couldn't shake the sensation of Gordon's cold handshake, or the way his eyes had cataloged every detail of my appearance. Despite Jade's assurances, something about Gordon felt deeply wrong, a feeling I would later wish I had trusted more fully. Within hours of meeting Gordon, my phone buzzed with a new group message. Created new chat, weekend friends, read the notification, followed by Gordon's first message. A meme about pizza that wasn't particularly funny. He added you to our chat, Jade texted privately. Sorry, he does this. Over the next weeks, Gordon maintained a careful digital presence, sending just enough messages to remain connected without crossing into obvious harassment. His strategy seemed calculated. A funny video on Tuesday, a local news story on Thursday, an offer of assistance every Saturday morning, like clockwork. Need any help this weekend? Became his refrain, accompanied by lists of errands he could run or tasks he could complete. I consistently declined with brief politeness. All good this weekend, but thanks. His responses were always immediate and excessive. No problem at all. Just let me know if anything changes. Happy to help anytime. Enjoy your weekend. The exclamation points felt like tiny shouts of desperation. Through Jade, I learned more about Gordon's involvement in her life. He had somehow integrated himself into her routine, delivering groceries she never requested, appearing with coffee when she casually mentioned being tired, offering rides when her car was in the shop. Doesn't it concern you? I asked during one of our phone calls. How much he knows about your schedule? Sometimes, she admitted, but it's also really convenient, and he never asks for anything in return. That's what worries me, I replied. People usually want something. When Gordon began referencing details I'd mentioned in conversations with Jade, my dislike of mushrooms, my work schedule, a planned trip to visit my parents, I realized he was extracting information indirectly. His knowledge accumulated in small, seemingly innocuous pieces. My favorite coffee shop, my running route, my car's make and model, my apartment building's layout, each detail insignificant alone but disturbing in aggregate. I began carefully filtering information shared with Jade, knowing it might reach Gordon. This caution proved justified when he sent a get-well-soon message after I'd called in sick to work, information I'd only shared with my boss and Jade. The persistent offers of help continued until, in a moment of poor judgment I would come to deeply regret, I finally accepted. The washing machine in my apartment building had been broken for 2 weeks when I spotted a reasonably priced replacement on an online marketplace. The problem? I had no way to transport it, and professional installation was beyond my budget. During a moment of frustration, I mentioned this in the group chat. Gordon's response was instantaneous. I can help. I have a truck and know how to install washing machines. When would work for you? After a day of deliberation and Jade's assurance that Gordon had helped her with similar tasks, I reluctantly agreed. That would be really helpful, actually. Are you sure it's not too much trouble? No trouble at all. Happy to help, came his eager reply. That Saturday, Gordon arrived in a meticulously clean pickup truck, wearing work gloves and carrying a toolbox that appeared to contain every possible tool required. The efficiency with which he loaded the washing machine, transported it, and installed it in my apartment was admittedly impressive. What unsettled me was his attention to my living space. The way his eyes lingered on family photos, how he noted my book collection, the casual opening of cabinets under the premise of looking for connections. "You have a nice place," he commented, his gaze sweeping across my apartment in what felt like memorization. "Very secure building, too. Good locks." When the installation was complete, I attempted to pay him for his time and effort. "Please, let me give you something for all this work." Gordon shook his head firmly. "I don't want your money." "Then at least let me buy you lunch or something," I insisted, uncomfortable with the imbalance of obligation. His expression shifted subtly. "Actually, there is something." He maintained casual eye contact that felt anything but casual. "There's this trail I know, not far from here. Great views. Maybe we could hike it sometime? This weekend, perhaps?" The request hung in the air, seemingly innocent yet loaded with implication. My instinct screamed to decline, but the weight of social obligation, he had just spent 3 hours helping me, made outright rejection difficult. "I suppose that would work," I heard myself agreeing. "Just a short hike, though. I have plans later in the day." Gordon's face transformed with genuine pleasure. "Great. I'll pick you up Sunday at 9. After he left, I immediately called Jade. "I just agreed to go hiking with Gordon." "Oh," she paused. "That's new. He's never asked me to do anything social." "Should I be worried?" I asked directly. "No," she answered, though her hesitation was noticeable. "He's odd but harmless. Just maybe keep your location shared with me." That night, I researched the trail Gordon had mentioned. Oak Ridge Trail, a popular local hiking spot with well-traveled paths and regular ranger patrols. This knowledge provided some comfort, but anxiety still crept through my dreams, manifesting as visions of forests and watching eyes. Sunday morning arrived with perfect autumn clarity, crisp air, golden sunlight, and a sky so intensely blue it seemed artificially enhanced. Under different circumstances, it would have been an ideal day for hiking. Gordon arrived precisely at 9, his truck freshly washed, wearing hiking boots that appeared brand new. He had brought water bottles, trail mix, and a first aid kit, all presented with a shopkeeper's pride. "Safety first," he said, indicating the kit. "Never know what might happen on a trail." The drive to Oak Ridge was filled with Gordon's monologue about local history, plant identification, and hiking safety, information delivered with the rehearsed quality of a tour guide. I contributed occasional acknowledgments while sharing my location with both Jade and my sister. The trailhead parking lot contained several other vehicles, a reassuring sign of other hikers. Gordon seemed slightly disappointed by this. "It's busier than usual," he remarked. "We might want to take one of the less traveled paths to get the full experience." "I prefer staying on the main trail," I countered firmly, "especially since I'm not familiar with this area." He acquiesced with a tight smile, and we began our hike on the well-marked main path. For the first mile, everything progressed normally. Gordon maintained a respectful distance, pointed out interesting plants, and shared genuinely engaging facts about local wildlife. The tension in my shoulders began to ease slightly as we passed other hiking groups. Then we reached a fork in the trail. "The main path continues that way," Gordon indicated the wider, clearly maintained route. "But there's something really special down this side trail, something not many people get to see." The smaller path veered sharply downhill, disappearing into denser forest. No other hikers were visible in that direction. "What's down there?" I asked, remaining firmly in place. "It's hard to explain," Gordon replied, his voice taking on an unusual intensity. "It's something I discovered a few weeks ago. Something remarkable. I've been waiting for the right person to share it with." Alarm bells screamed in my mind as Gordon stepped closer, his expression shifting into something I hadn't seen before, an almost childlike excitement tinged with something darker. "It's not far," he continued, already moving toward the side path. "Just 5 minutes. You'll never forget it, I promise." Making a split-second decision I would later recognize as profoundly unwise, I followed, partially from curiosity, partially from the social pressure of not wanting to seem unreasonable, and partially from the false security of knowing others were nearby on the main trail. The side path descended steeply, forcing us to navigate exposed roots and slippery leaves. The sunlight diminished as the tree canopy thickened overhead, temperature dropping noticeably. Gordon moved with unexpected agility, frequently looking back to ensure I was following. After several minutes, longer than the promised 5, Gordon stopped abruptly. "We're almost there," he whispered, though there was no apparent reason for lowered voices. "Just through these trees." He pushed aside a branch, revealing a small clearing surrounded by dense undergrowth. My heart rate accelerated as I stepped forward, unsure what I expected to find. What awaited would permanently alter the trajectory of my life. The clearing was unremarkable at first glance, a depression in the forest floor scattered with fallen leaves and broken branches. Then the smell registered, a heavy, sickly sweet odor that caught in my throat and triggered an instinctive recoil. Gordon stood motionless, watching me intently. "Do you see it?" I didn't want to look where he was indicating, but my eyes followed his gesture to a disturbed area of ground partially concealed by gathered branches and leaves. Through the deliberate camouflage, I could distinguish the unmistakable shape of a human form. The body lay face up, partially buried but clearly visible. A man in his 40s, dressed in hiking clothes now discolored and degraded. Natural decomposition had begun its inexorable process, the face distorted but still recognizably human. Various insects moved purposefully across the exposed skin. My body responded before my mind could process, stepping backward, breathing quickening, fingernails digging into my palms. "Isn't it fascinating?" Gordon's voice had transformed, carrying a reverent quality that chilled me more than the sight itself. "I found him 3 weeks ago. No one else knows he's here." Horror compounded as the implications clarified. Gordon had discovered a dead body in the woods and chosen to keep it secret, to preserve it as a macabre exhibit to share with select viewers. "We need to call the police," I managed, voice barely cooperating. Gordon continued as if I hadn't spoken. "At first the smell was overwhelming, but it's better now. I've been documenting the changes. Nature's recycling process is remarkably efficient." The casualness of his tone, discussing human decomposition as one might describe a science experiment, triggered a surge of adrenaline. My survival instincts finally overcame social conditioning. "I think I'm going to be sick," I gasped, turning away. "I need to get back to the main trail." Gordon stepped closer, his expression showing not concern, but disappointment. "We just got here. Don't you want to look closer? The way the insects have specialized is truly remarkable." "No," I said firmly, already moving backward. "I need air. We need to report this immediately." As I retreated up the path, Gordon followed reluctantly. "Most people don't understand," he called after me. "They're disconnected from the reality of death. This is natural, beautiful even." I increased my pace, desperate to reach other hikers. The isolation of the side trail now felt suffocating, the distance back to safety impossibly long. Gordon kept pace easily, continuing his disturbing commentary. When we finally emerged onto the main trail, I spotted an older couple approaching. With forced casualness that took tremendous effort, I called out to them. "Excuse me, could you point us toward the trailhead? I think we took a wrong turn." The man consulted a trail map. "You're heading the right way, but it's about 2 miles back." "Would you mind if we walked with you?" I asked, ignoring Gordon's frown. "I'm feeling a bit lightheaded." The couple agreed readily, and I positioned myself between them and Gordon, ensuring I wouldn't be left alone with him again. The mile-long walk back felt interminable, my mind racing between processing what I'd seen and planning my next actions. As we approached the parking area, I pulled out my phone and pretended to receive a call. "Hi, Jade," I said to the silent phone. "Yes, I'm still with Gordon. We're just finishing our hike. I'll have him drop me at your place in about 20 minutes, okay?" Gordon watched this performance with narrowed eyes but said nothing. Inside Gordon's truck, silence hung heavily as we pulled away from the trailhead. My heart hammered against my ribs as I gripped my phone tightly, ready to call emergency services at the first sign of danger. "You didn't enjoy our discovery," Gordon finally said, his tone suggesting genuine bewilderment. "Gordon, that was a dead person," I stated firmly. "Someone who should be reported to authorities and returned to their family." He shrugged slightly. "Death is part of life. Most people hide from it, but I find that dishonest." "Did you—" I hesitated, uncertain how to phrase my suspicion. "How did you first find the body?" "Hiking," he answered simply. "Same trail, about 3 weeks ago. I was exploring off-path, and there he was. I studied his profile, searching for tells of deception. And you didn't report it because reports mean paperwork, questions, interruptions to the natural process. His fingers tightened on the steering wheel. People fear what they don't understand. While his explanation left critical questions unanswered, his attention remained fortunately focused on driving. I texted Jade under the guise of checking my notifications. Emergency. Gordon showed me a dead body in the woods, not joking. Coming to your place. Call police after we arrive. Her response was immediate. What? Are you safe? Should I call now? Wait until I'm there. Don't want him to run. Act normal when we arrive. The 20-minute drive stretched into eternity. I maintained superficial conversation while mentally cataloging every detail I could remember about the body and location to report to police. When we finally reached Jade's apartment, she was waiting outside, her casual pose betrayed by the tension visible in her shoulders. Thanks for the ride, I told Gordon, exiting quickly. And the hike. We should do it again, he suggested, seeming genuinely oblivious to the horror of the situation. There's more to see on other trails. Sure, I lied. Text me. Jade and I watched him drive away before rushing inside. The moment her door closed, I collapsed against it, trembling uncontrollably. Tell me everything, she demanded. Between gasping breaths, I recounted the discovery. Jade called the police immediately, her voice steady despite her pallor. Within 30 minutes, 2 detectives sat in Jade's living room as I detailed my experience. They listened with professional detachment, occasionally interjecting with clarifying questions. And you're certain the individual was deceased? One asked. Not injured? Absolutely certain, I confirmed. Decomposition was advanced. They asked about Gordon, his full name, address, how we knew him, his behavior before and after showing me the body. I described his disturbing fascination and lack of appropriate emotional response. We'll need you to guide officers to the location, the detective explained. Can you do that tomorrow morning? I nodded, despite the revulsion at the thought of returning. After they left, Jade and I sat in stunned silence before she finally spoke. I never thought he was strange, but this... We need to cut him out completely, I insisted. Block his number, his social media, everything. What if he retaliates? She whispered. He knows where we both live. The realization that Gordon now presented an active threat rather than merely an unsettling presence settled over us like a shroud. We need a plan, I said. A careful exit strategy. The following weeks unfolded in a blur of police statements, nightmares, and constant vigilance. I led officers to the body, which was recovered and later identified as a 45-year-old hiker who had been reported missing a month earlier. Cause of death was determined to be a cardiac event, a natural death that Gordon had transformed into something macabre through his actions. Gordon himself remained disturbingly present in our periphery. His messages continued as if nothing had happened, though we responded with increasing brevity. Police questioned him extensively about his failure to report finding the body, but without evidence of foul play in the hiker's death. They could only charge him with relatively minor offenses related to interfering with a death scene. Our exit strategy from Gordon's life proceeded with excruciating slowness. We feared that an abrupt disconnection might trigger escalation, so instead we implemented a deliberate fade, delayed responses, claims of busyness, gradual unavailability. Gordon seemed to sense the withdrawal. His messages increased in frequency even as our responses decreased. He appeared unexpectedly outside Jade's workplace one afternoon just to say hello, and left packages of unrequested groceries at our doors. The breakthrough came unexpectedly when Jade began dating someone. When she mentioned her new relationship in our group chat, Gordon's messages suddenly ceased entirely. The silence was both relieving and unnerving. 3 months after the hiking incident, police arrested a man in connection with another death, a homicide that had occurred in the same forest region. Through social media investigation, they discovered this man had connections to Gordon. They followed each other on several platforms and had exchanged messages. While Gordon was never charged with direct involvement in any homicide, the investigation revealed disturbing patterns in his behavior. Documented fascination with death scenes, extensive photography of roadkill and dead animals, and journal entries detailing his observations of decomposition processes. Psychological evaluation concluded he suffered from a complex combination of conditions that manifested in his inappropriate responses to death and human remains, along with his patterns of intrusive behavior and social misconduct. Today, 5 years later, I still avoid hiking trails. The rustle of leaves in wooded areas triggers immediate anxiety. Jade has moved to another state, partly motivated by putting distance between herself and the memories of Gordon. The last we heard, Gordon had been institutionalized after an incident involving cemetery desecration. While his direct connection to any murder remains unproven, his relationship with death continues to exist outside normal human boundaries. What stays with me most isn't the disturbing image of the body in the woods, though that appears often enough in dreams. Rather, it's the memory of Gordon's expression as he showed me his discovery, the genuine incomprehension that I didn't share his fascination, the complete disconnect from normal human emotion. In the years since, I've come to understand that the most terrifying monsters aren't supernatural creatures lurking in shadows. They're the people walking among us whose internal landscape is so fundamentally different from our own that connection becomes impossible. People who look human but operate by unfathomable rules. I keep my doors doubly locked now. I verify the identity of delivery people through peepholes. I no longer give out my phone number casually, and I've become selective about which social media platforms I use. Most importantly, I've learned to trust that flutter of unease when something feels wrong about a person or situation. That sensation exists for a reason, an evolutionary warning system honed over millennia of human experience. When someone shows you who they are, especially in small, unsettling ways, believe them the first time. Your survival may depend on it. My name is John Erskine, and this happened to me back in 2012 in the Allegheny National Forest in Pennsylvania. I'd been living in a small cabin a few miles off the old service road, trying to make a quiet life without power lines or neighbors. I liked it that way. I had a small hand-built shelter with a wood stove and a cot, a rain barrel, and enough canned goods to get by for months if I had to. The forest stretched in all directions, thick with oak and beech trees, their leaves filtering the sunlight so it always felt like late afternoon under the canopy. Back then, the sound of nothing, that gentle hush of wind and distant bird calls, soothed my nerves. I felt at home. People often ask why I chose to live that way. The truth is complicated. 3 years before, I'd walked away from a career in architectural engineering after a building collapse killed 2 workers. The investigation cleared me of wrongdoing, but I couldn't shake the guilt. The sound of their names being read at the memorial service still echoed in my head on quiet nights. So I retreated, inch by inch, from civilization. First to a small apartment in Pittsburgh, then to a rental cottage in rural Butler County, and finally to this cabin I purchased for cash from an old hunter who could no longer make the trek into the woods. The transaction was simple: $10,000, a handshake, and a crude hand-drawn map marking the property lines. The cabin itself was primitive but sturdy. 18 by 24 feet, with rough-hewn logs chinked with a mixture of clay and moss. The roof was simple cedar shakes I'd repaired myself during that first spring. Inside, I had the basics: the wood stove that served for both heating and cooking, a small table with 2 chairs, though I never had visitors, shelves lined with canned goods and supplies, and my cot with wool blankets that smelled of cedar and smoke. I rarely saw anyone else. On a good week, I might spot a single vehicle rumbling far off on a dirt road, or glimpse a pair of hikers passing by a few ridges over. That year had been especially quiet. The only real human contact came when I hiked out twice a month for supplies at a gas station off Route 66, where the clerk sometimes called me Mountain Man and asked if I was crazy to live that way. The clerk, an older man named Roy with tobacco-stained fingers and cracked leather skin, once told me, "Wood's got eyes, you know, always watching. Man ain't meant to be alone out there." I laughed it off, but sometimes in the dead of night, when the wind died down completely and the forest fell unnaturally silent, I wondered if he was right. My days followed a simple rhythm. I woke with the sun, cooked a small breakfast of oatmeal or whatever I had on hand, and spent the morning on maintenance tasks. Afternoons were for gathering firewood, hunting, checking my crude traps for rabbits, or tending to the small garden I'd started behind the cabin where the sun broke through the canopy for a few precious hours. Evenings were for reading dog-eared paperbacks by oil lamplight, writing in my journal, or just sitting outside watching the stars emerge between the treetops. One evening, early October, I remember the sun dipping low and the air cooling fast. The leaves were starting to turn, painting the forest in fierce oranges and deep reds. I'd been cutting deadwood for the stove and stacking it behind the cabin. I kept my tools neat: an old axe with a hickory handle smoothed by years of use, a worn handsaw that needed sharpening, and a hatchet for kindling. After a few hours, my arms ached nicely, and I felt good about my work. I sat out front on a stump I'd fashioned into a seat, chewing on some jerky, watching a few crows hop around the clearing. The forest had felt different that day. Quieter than usual. No distant woodpeckers, fewer squirrels chattering in the branches. Even the wind seemed reluctant to stir the leaves. I didn't think much of it then. Weather changes, animals migrating, nothing unusual for autumn. As the light faded, I noticed movement near the creek that trickled about 100 yards downhill from my cabin. I squinted, trying to make out what it was. At first, I assumed it was a deer carcass. Hunters sometimes failed to track their kill properly, and it wouldn't be the first time I'd found the remains of someone else's hunt. But I didn't see antlers, didn't see the shape move. Something felt wrong. The air seemed to thicken around me as I stared at that dark shape near the creek bed. I set down my jerky and stood, stretching my stiff back. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was something that needed investigating before dark. Either way, I needed to know. I grabbed my leather gloves and a walking stick I'd carved from ash wood, more out of habit than any sense of danger. The sun had nearly disappeared behind the western ridge, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers across the leaf-strewn ground. Should check it out, I muttered to myself, breaking the silence that had settled around me. My voice sounded strange in my ears, too loud and yet somehow muffled by the dense forest air. I started down the gentle slope toward the creek, not knowing that in the next few hours, everything about my quiet life would change forever. The forest floor crunched beneath my boots as I made my way downhill. Fallen leaves in amber and russet formed a crackling carpet that made stealth impossible. I followed a faint game trail worn by deer coming to drink at the creek, winding between old-growth trees with trunks wider than my outstretched arms. As I got closer, I could make out more details of the strange object. It wasn't a deer, after all. It was something bright, unnaturally bright for the forest, a splash of vivid color against the earthy palette of autumn. A backpack, bright red with black straps, lying in the brush at an odd angle, as if it had been thrown or dropped in haste. I paused, scanning the area. Hikers weren't uncommon in the national forest, but they rarely ventured this far from the marked trails, and they certainly didn't abandon expensive gear without good reason. "Hello?" I called out, my voice swallowed by the dense trees. No response came except for the startled flutter of wings as a bird took flight somewhere above me. I approached cautiously, looking for signs of whoever had left the pack behind. The ground around it showed scuff marks and broken twigs, signs of a struggle or someone moving erratically. I crouched beside the backpack, noting how the main compartment had been torn open, its contents scattered. A few protein bars with the wrappers still intact, a high-end flashlight that still worked when I pressed the button, a single hiking boot with the laces undone, and a trail map from some local outfitter. I picked up the map, unfolding it with care. A route had been marked in red pen, starting from the Millstone Creek trailhead about 5 miles east and venturing deep into the forest, right through the area where my cabin stood. Someone had written, "Day 2 inches" near my section of the woods. An uneasy feeling settled in my stomach, cold and heavy. Something was wrong here. People don't just abandon their gear in the wilderness without reason. I folded the map and stood, intending to gather the scattered items. That's when I noticed the drag marks in the soft earth near the creek bank. A long, irregular furrow leading away from the backpack and deeper into the undergrowth. I hesitated. Part of me wanted to turn around, walk back to my cabin, and pretend I'd seen nothing. The forest had always been my sanctuary, not a place of dread. But curiosity pushed me forward, one reluctant step after another, following those drag marks through a thicket of mountain laurel. The brush opened to a small clearing, and that's where I found him. A man lying face down, his jacket pushed up around his shoulders, exposing a thin strip of pale skin above his jeans. The back of his head was matted with something dark and sticky that caught the fading light with a sickening gleam. His left arm bent under him at an impossible angle, and he didn't move at all. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The man looked to be around 30, with short brown hair and an Apache-style beard. He wore expensive hiking gear, the kind serious outdoorsmen invest in, not casual weekend warriors. "Hey," I called weakly, though I already knew he wouldn't answer. The stillness around him had the unmistakable quality of death. No rise and fall of breathing, no subtle shifts of a body at rest. I approached slowly, as if he might suddenly sit up. The smell hit me when I got closer. Metallic and organic, the unmistakable scent of fresh blood mixed with something else, something worse. I knelt beside him, touching his neck with 2 fingers, searching for a pulse I knew I wouldn't find. His skin felt cool but not cold, meaning he hadn't been dead long. Hours, not days. The back of his skull had been crushed by something heavy, caved in like an eggshell. Dried blood formed a dark halo in the dirt beneath his head. This wasn't an accident. No fall could cause damage this severe. This was murder. I rocked back on my heels, my mind racing. I needed to report this. The nearest ranger station was 15 miles away, the closest phone even further. By the time I got help and returned, it would be well past midnight. A twig snapped somewhere uphill. The sound cut through my thoughts like a knife. I turned sharply, scanning the forest behind me. The day had faded to dusk, shadows deepening between the trees. Then I saw them. 2 figures picking their way through the brush about 40 yards away. One wore a stained yellow jacket, loose and torn at the elbows, with pale, bony arms protruding. He moved with an unsettling grace, like a predator accustomed to stalking prey. At his side hung a long hunting knife with a black handle, the blade catching what little light remained. His face looked narrow and sharp, with a crooked nose and a beard trimmed into a rough goatee. The other man was heavier set, with broad shoulders straining against a sweat-soaked gray t-shirt despite the cool evening air. He cradled something in his right hand, a metal pipe or tool that gleamed dully. His face was partially obscured by a dark baseball cap pulled low, but I could see a thick jaw covered in stubble. They weren't hikers, they weren't forest rangers. They were moving with purpose, scanning the ground, following a trail, my trail. And based on the dead man at my feet, I had a terrible suspicion about who they were and what they'd done. Our eyes met across the distance. For a moment, nobody moved. The thin man narrowed his eyes and slowly shook his head, a subtle warning that sent ice through my veins. Run. That single word pulsed through my mind, overriding all other thoughts. I turned and fled uphill, abandoning any pretense of careful movement. Branches whipped my face as I crashed through the undergrowth, my boots slipping on damp leaves. Behind me, I heard them give chase, their movements just as frantic and much less cautious. "Get him!" a rough voice shouted, followed by the sound of snapping branches and heavy footfalls. I knew these woods better than they did. That was my only advantage. I veered off the path I'd taken down, cutting across a steeper section where fallen trees created natural barriers. My lungs burned as I pushed uphill, propelled by raw fear. My cabin was about 200 yards away, just over the next rise. I could make it if I kept moving, if I didn't fall. The growing darkness worked both for and against me. Harder for them to spot me, but easier for me to miss my footing. A rock turned under my boot and I stumbled, barely catching myself on a tree trunk. The rough bark scraped my palms as I pushed off again, hearing my pursuers gaining ground. The heavier man was cursing steadily, his breathing labored but determined. I crested the small ridge and saw my cabin ahead, a dark silhouette against the deepening blue of the evening sky. Never had that simple structure looked so much like salvation. I sprinted across the clearing, making for the tool shed where I'd left my axe after splitting wood. The shed door squeaked as I yanked it open, fumbling in the darkness for the familiar wooden handle. My fingers closed around it just as the two men emerged from the trees at the edge of my property. I backed away from the shed, axe gripped tightly in both hands, and moved behind the cabin where shadows would hide me. My heart hammered so hard I was certain they could hear it. I pressed my back against the rough logs and tried to control my breathing, listening for their approach. For a long minute, silence stretched across the clearing. Had they lost track of me? Had they given up? I dared to hope. But then I heard the crunch of boots on dry leaves coming steadily closer. "I know you're here," the thin man called, his voice deceptively calm. "We just want to talk." The absurdity of his words might have made me laugh if I wasn't terrified. They hadn't chased me through the forest to talk. They'd killed one man already. I was a witness. The math wasn't complicated. I gripped the axe tighter, my palms slick with sweat. I had to move. Staying put would only corner me. I edged along the cabin wall, trying to keep my footsteps silent, working my way toward the front where I might have a chance to make a break for deeper woods. A twig snapped under my boot, the sound impossibly loud in the stillness. "There!" the heavier man shouted, and heavy footsteps pounded toward my position. I abandoned stealth and ran, but I'd waited too long. The thin man appeared around the corner of the cabin, his knife already raised. Our eyes met, and I saw nothing human there, just cold calculation and the promise of violence. He lunged. I swung the axe in a wild arc. The night had just begun. The axe whistled through the air, missing the thin man by inches as he danced backward with surprising agility. His eyes widened slightly. Perhaps he hadn't expected me to fight back, before narrowing with renewed determination. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said, his voice unnervingly gentle, like someone speaking to a frightened animal. I didn't respond. Words seemed pointless now. I adjusted my grip on the axe and kept my eyes on his knife, a serious hunting blade, at least 8 inches long with a serrated section near the handle. The kind designed for gutting and skinning. We circled each other in the growing darkness, the space between the cabin and the tree line becoming our arena. I was acutely aware of every sound, his soft footfalls, my own ragged breathing, and the absence of the heavier man's movements. Where was he? The answer came with brutal clarity as a shadow detached itself from the side of the cabin. The heavier man had circled around while his partner kept me distracted. He swung the metal pipe in a vicious arc toward my head. I jerked backward, but not fast enough. The pipe glanced off my left shoulder, sending a bolt of white-hot pain down my arm. I staggered, nearly dropping the axe, my vision blurring momentarily. The thin man seized the opportunity, darting forward with his knife. I twisted away, feeling the blade slice through my jacket sleeve and into the flesh of my forearm. Warm blood immediately soaked the fabric, but adrenaline dulled the pain to a distant throb. I swung the axe one-handed, forcing them both to retreat briefly. My injured arm hung awkwardly at my side, blood dripping from my fingertips onto the fallen leaves below. "You've got spirit," the thin man said, almost admiringly. "Most would have collapsed by now." "What do you want?" I finally asked, my voice hoarse. "I don't have anything worth taking." The heavier man chuckled, a sound like stones grinding together. "It ain't about taking. It's about leaving no trace." They began to separate, moving to flank me on either side. I backed up until I felt the cabin wall behind me, eliminating one avenue of attack but trapping myself in the process. My options were dwindling rapidly. The cabin door was about 15 feet to my right. If I could reach it, get inside, perhaps I could barricade myself and find another weapon. The shotgun stored in the loft suddenly seemed like my only hope. I feinted left, then pivoted right and sprinted for the door. The thin man anticipated my move and lunged to intercept me, but I brought the axe down in a desperate swing that forced him to dive aside. The heavier man was slower to react, giving me the seconds I needed to reach the door. I practically threw myself inside, slamming the door shut behind me and fumbling with the simple wooden latch. It wouldn't hold them for long. The door was sturdy enough for keeping out curious animals, not determined killers, but it might buy me precious time. Inside, the cabin was dark and still. I moved by memory and touch, making my way to the small table and dragging it across the plank floor to wedge against the door. My wounded arm protested every movement, hot streams of blood making my grip slippery. "We know you saw us," the thin man called from outside, his voice muffled by the logs between us. "We know you saw him too. Can't let you go telling tales." I ignored his words, focused entirely on survival. I grabbed a clean dish towel from beside my wash basin and hastily wrapped it around my forearm, cinching it tight with my teeth and good hand. The white fabric immediately bloomed red, but the pressure slowed the bleeding. Next, I needed a better weapon. The kitchen knife was pathetically inadequate, barely 6 inches long, with a cheap, dull blade I used for opening cans and cutting vegetables. But it was better than nothing. I snatched it from its place on the shelf, then looked around the dark cabin for anything else that might serve. The shotgun. My grandfather's old Remington pump action, stored in the loft for years, practically forgotten. Did I even have shells for it? I couldn't remember the last time I'd fired it or checked its condition. Outside, I heard the men conferring in low voices. Then footsteps circling the cabin, testing windows, looking for weaknesses. I used the moment to climb the rickety ladder to the loft, moving as quietly as possible on the creaking wood. The loft was cramped and dusty, hardly more than a storage space under the peaked roof. I felt around in the darkness, hands skimming over cardboard boxes and cloth bundles. Finally, my fingers touched cold metal, the shotgun wrapped in an old oilcloth. I pulled it free, heart pounding with desperate hope. The weapon felt heavier than I remembered, the blued steel catching what little moonlight filtered through the small loft window. I broke it open, peering down the barrel. Clean enough, no obvious obstructions. But without shells, it was just an awkward club. Where would I have put ammunition? Think, John, think. A small tin box came to mind, the one where I kept odd valuables and emergency supplies. I scrabbled through the loft items until I found it, prying open the rusty lid with trembling fingers. Inside, nestled among old photos and important papers, lay a small cardboard box of shotgun shells, half full. I nearly wept at the sight. With fumbling haste, I loaded 2 shells into the gun, the satisfying click of each round sliding home the most beautiful sound I'd ever heard. A loud thud from below jolted me to attention. They were testing the door, pushing against my makeshift barricade. The table legs scraped against the floor as the door opened an inch before catching on the obstruction. "He's barricaded it," the heavier man growled. "Want me to break a window?" "No," the thin man replied. "Too much noise. We'll get through the door." I eased back down the ladder, shotgun cradled in my good arm, and positioned myself across from the entrance. The limited space of the cabin left few tactical options. I had one advantage. In the darkness, I knew every inch of this place by heart. The door shuddered as something heavy slammed against it. The table legs skidded another inch across the floor. Another impact, and the wooden latch splintered audibly. "We're coming in," the thin man announced, as if he were a dinner guest politely giving warning. "Put down whatever you've got, and we'll make it quick." The calm in his voice chilled me more than any shouting could have. These weren't hot-headed attackers acting on impulse. They were methodical, practiced. The dead hiker hadn't been their first victim, and they didn't intend for me to be their last witness. I raised the shotgun, bracing it against my injured shoulder despite the pain. My finger rested lightly on the trigger as another blow struck the door, wood cracking along the frame. "Last chance," I called out, my voice steadier than I felt. "Walk away now." Their response was another powerful hit that sent the table skidding backward. The door flew open several inches, enough for the thin man to wedge his knife through the gap, working to push the table further aside. I aimed at the opening and waited, forcing myself to breathe slowly. The next few seconds would determine everything. The door burst inward with a crash as both men put their weight against it, sending the table tumbling over. They rushed in together, the thin man leading with his knife extended, the heavier one right behind with the pipe raised high. Time seemed to slow. I saw every detail with preternatural clarity. The gleam of moonlight on the knife blade, the dark stains on the pipe that I now recognized as dried blood, the wild determination in their eyes. I squeezed the trigger. The shotgun's roar filled the small cabin, deafening in the enclosed space. The thin man took the blast directly in the chest, the force lifting him off his feet and throwing him backward into his partner. Both men crashed into the doorframe in a tangle of limbs. For a moment, nobody moved. Then the thin man slid to the floor, knife clattering from lifeless fingers, a dark stain spreading across his yellow jacket. His eyes stared upward, seeing nothing. The heavier man struggled to extricate himself, stunned by the sudden violence but apparently unharmed. He looked at his fallen companion, then at me, his face transforming with rage and disbelief. "You!" he began, raising the pipe again. I pumped the shotgun, chambering the second shell, the sound cutting off whatever he'd been about to say. Our eyes met across the dead man's body. He saw something in mine that made him hesitate. I fired again. The second blast tore through the cabin wall as the heavier man dove to the side, narrowly avoiding the full force of the shot. Splinters and debris filled the air, along with the acrid smell of gunpowder. My ears rang painfully from the twin explosions in the confined space. A pained grunt told me I hadn't missed entirely. The heavier man staggered outside, one hand pressed to his side. I pumped the shotgun again, but realized with sinking dread that I had no more shells in the chamber. The remaining ammunition was still upstairs in the loft. For a heartbeat, I stood frozen, the empty weapon still raised. The thin man lay motionless by the door, a grim testament to what happens when flesh meets buckshot at close range. His blood pooled on my plank floor, black in the dim light. Outside, I heard labored breathing and muttered curses. The heavier man was wounded but alive, and now he knew I'd fired my last shot. I had seconds at most before he recovered enough to come at me again. I dropped the shotgun and grabbed the kitchen knife from the counter, a poor replacement but better than nothing. My injured arm throbbed mercilessly, the dish towel bandage now soaked through with blood. Lightheadedness threatened to overwhelm me as adrenaline battled blood loss. "You're dead," the man outside growled, his voice tight with pain. "You hear me? Fucking dead." I moved to the doorway, knife held before me, and peered cautiously into the darkness. The clearing around my cabin was washed in pale moonlight, shadows stretching long across the leaf-strewn ground. The heavier man had retreated to the edge of the trees, about 20 yards away. He stood hunched, one hand still clutched to his side, the other gripping the metal pipe. Blood stained his gray shirt in a spreading pattern. The shotgun pellets had caught him along the ribs. Not immediately fatal, but serious enough that he needed medical attention sooner rather than later. That knowledge didn't seem to have dampened his rage, however. His eyes, visible even in the darkness, burned with hatred. "You can't run," he said. "You know that, right? Even if you kill me, they'll find you." "They?" I echoed, the word slipping out before I could stop it. A grim smile twisted his features. "You think it's just us? You think we're alone out here?" He gestured vaguely toward the darkened forest. "There's more. Always more." Was he bluffing? Trying to rattle me? Or was there truth in his words? I thought about the dead hiker, about how methodically these two had tracked me. They weren't random killers. They had purpose, perhaps even organization. "The ranger station knows I'm here," I lied, keeping my voice steady. "They check on me weekly. They'll be coming soon." He laughed, a harsh sound that ended in a pained cough. "Nobody knows you're here, mountain man. Nobody cares. You disappeared from the world, remember? That's why you came out here, to vanish." The truth in his words stung worse than my wound. I had deliberately severed my connections to the outside world, left no forwarding address, maintained no regular contact with anyone. My isolation, once a comfort, now felt like a noose tightening around my neck. We stood at an impasse, him too injured to rush me too wounded to pursue him. The night stretched silent around us, indifferent to our bloody standoff. "Walk away," I said finally. "You're bleeding badly. Get help and I won't come after you." "Generous," he spat. "But we both know how this ends. One of us doesn't leave these woods." He straightened slightly, seeming to gather his strength. I tensed, preparing for another attack. But instead of charging, he backed further into the tree line, his form gradually blending with the shadows. "This isn't over," his voice floated back, already sounding fainter. "Not by a long shot." Then he was gone, swallowed by the darkness of the forest that had been my sanctuary and now felt like a prison. I stood in the doorway for long minutes, straining to hear any sound of his return. But the night offered only the usual chorus of insects and the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze. Finally, the shock began to wear off, and the full impact of what had happened hit me like a physical blow. I stumbled back inside, careful to step around the dead man's body, and collapsed onto my cot. My hands shook uncontrollably as I unwrapped the blood-soaked towel from my arm to examine the damage. The knife wound was deep but clean, a straight slice about 4 inches long that had narrowly missed major blood vessels. It needed stitches, but I'd have to make do with what I had. I cleaned it as best I could with water and the bottle of whiskey I kept for medicinal purposes, biting down on a leather belt to keep from crying out as the alcohol scorched the open flesh. From my sparse medical supplies, I found butterfly bandages and wound closure strips. Not ideal, but they would have to suffice. I pulled the edges of the wound together, securing them with the strips, then wrapped the whole arm in clean bandaging, cinching it tight enough to control bleeding without cutting off circulation. My shoulder throbbed where the pipe had struck it, but nothing felt broken, just bruised muscle and perhaps a hairline fracture that would heal with time. I swallowed 2 ibuprofen tablets dry, knowing they'd hardly touch the pain, but needing to do something, anything, to maintain control. Only then did I allow myself to look at the dead man by my door. In death, he seemed smaller somehow, crumpled against the doorframe in an awkward pose, his yellow jacket now more red than yellow. His face was turned away, for which I was grateful. I'd seen enough death for one night. What was I supposed to do now? The obvious answer, call the police, wasn't an option for my isolated cabin. The nearest landline was at the gas station, 15 miles away through dark forest, with a wounded killer potentially waiting in the trees. Even if I made it, what would I say? That I'd killed a man in self-defense after finding a murder victim in the woods? That there might be others out there, as the heavier man had implied? I needed evidence. Something to corroborate my story when I eventually reported this nightmare to authorities. The hiker's backpack, the body by the creek, these would support my account, assuming the killers didn't return to remove them. A new urgency gripped me. I needed to document everything before anything changed. I lit several oil lamps, illuminating the cabin in a warm, flickering glow that made the blood look almost black against the wooden floor. I found my old digital camera in a drawer, rarely used but still functional, its battery holding enough charge for what I needed. I forced myself to photograph everything. The dead man and his knife, the damage to my door, my own injuries, the shotgun and spent shells. Each click of the shutter felt like another nail in a coffin, sealing away any chance I had of returning to my peaceful existence. When the grim task was complete, I faced my next dilemma. The body. I couldn't leave it where it lay, not with the potential for the wounded man to return with reinforcements, not with the autumn heat that would accelerate decomposition. But moving it seemed equally impossible. Where would I put it? How would I explain if I was caught in the act? In the end, practicality won out. I grabbed a tarp from my storage area, laid it beside the body, and with great effort, rolled the dead man onto it. His lifeless weight was shocking, so much heavier than a living person of the same size would be. I wrapped the tarp around him, securing it with rope, trying to distance myself mentally from what I was doing. I dragged the bundle outside to the small shed behind my cabin, clearing a space among my tools and supplies. It wasn't a permanent solution, but it would have to do until morning when I could better assess my options. Back inside, I scrubbed at the bloodstains on the floor, knowing I could never remove them completely from the porous wood. The physical labor helped distract me from the throbbing pain in my arm and the chaos of my thoughts. What had I stumbled into? Who were these men, and why had they killed the hiker? The heavier man's implication that they weren't alone nagged at me, raising disturbing possibilities. Was there some kind of organized operation in these woods? Drug manufacturing, perhaps, or something even darker? As I cleaned, a terrible thought struck me. What if they knew who I was? What if they'd been watching my cabin for days or weeks, learning my routines, waiting for the right moment? The forest suddenly felt transparent, my every move exposed. I checked my windows, pulled down the few curtains I had, and extinguished all but one lamp. The darkness offered little comfort now, but at least it would hide me from watching eyes outside. Sleep was out of the question. I retrieved the remaining shotgun shells from the loft and reloaded the weapon, then positioned myself on a chair facing the door, determined to remain vigilant until dawn. The kitchen knife lay on the small table beside me, a backup I hoped not to need. Hours crawled by. Every creak of settling wood, every rustle of nocturnal animals outside sent a jolt of adrenaline through my system. Twice, I thought I heard footsteps and raised the shotgun, only to realize it was just the wind, or my own frayed nerves playing tricks. As the first hint of dawn lightened the eastern sky, I allowed myself to believe I might have survived the night. The heavier man hadn't returned. Perhaps his wounds were more serious than I'd thought, or perhaps he decided I wasn't worth the risk. But the day ahead loomed with impossible choices. Should I hike out to report what happened, leaving my cabin unguarded? Should I try to find the hiker's body again, gathering more evidence? Or should I simply flee, abandoning everything I'd built here and disappearing deeper into the wilderness? As gray light filtered through my windows, I realized that no option led back to the life I'd known. Whatever I chose, everything had changed. The isolation I'd sought had become a trap, and the peace I'd found was shattered beyond repair. I checked my bandaged arm, wincing as I flexed my fingers. The bleeding had stopped, but infection remained a serious concern. I'd need antibiotics soon, another reason to risk the journey to civilization. The dawn chorus of birds began outside, a jarring normalcy against the horror of the night. I rose stiffly from my chair, muscles protesting after hours of tense immobility. My decision crystallized with the growing light. I would hike out, report everything, and face whatever consequences came. The alternative, living in fear, looking over my shoulder, wondering when they might return, was no life at all. I gathered essential supplies into a small backpack: water, food, the camera with its grim documentation, a change of bandages for my arm, and a crude map I'd drawn of the area, marking both my cabin and approximately where I'd found the hiker's body. The shotgun I would carry openly, illegal in the national forest under normal circumstances, but these were far from normal circumstances. As I stepped outside into the cool morning air, the forest appeared unchanged. Ancient trees standing sentinel, mist curling between their trunks, dew glistening on spider webs strung between branches. Beautiful and indifferent to the violence that had transpired beneath its canopy. I locked my cabin door out of habit, though the splintered frame rendered it largely symbolic. With one last look at the place I'd called home, I turned east toward the rising sun and the long walk back to the world I'd left behind. Whatever waited for me there couldn't be worse than what lurked in these woods. At least, that's what I told myself as I took the first steps of my journey, shotgun cradled in my arms, senses alert for any sound of pursuit. The truth, as I would soon discover, was far more complicated and far more terrifying than I could have imagined. The 15-mile hike to the gas station proved more arduous than I anticipated. My wounded arm throbbed with each heartbeat, a persistent reminder of the night's violence. The forest, once a sanctuary, now felt hostile. Every shadow potentially concealing watchers, every snapping twig signaling pursuit. I kept the shotgun ready, its weight both a burden and a comfort as I followed faint trails eastward. By midday, fever had set in. My forehead burned while chills racked my body, clear signs of infection taking hold in my knife wound. The makeshift bandage had soaked through again, and when I paused to change it beside a small stream, the edges of the cut showed angry red inflammation. I cleaned it as best I could with stream water, applied my last antibiotic ointment, and rewrapped it with a fresh bandage from my pack. "Just keep moving," I muttered to myself, the sound of my voice startling in the quiet forest. One foot in front of the other. The terrain grew steeper as I approached the ridgeline that separated my valley from the more traveled areas of the national forest. Climbing with one good arm proved challenging, and twice I slipped on loose shale, reopening my wound and adding scrapes and bruises to my growing collection of injuries. By late afternoon, I reached the fire road that would lead to Route 66 and civilization. The packed dirt track felt unnervingly exposed after hours in the dense forest cover. I quickened my pace despite my exhaustion, driven by the irrational fear that I was being watched from the tree line. The sun was setting when I finally spotted the weathered, clapboard structure of Roy's Gas and Grocery, its single pump and faded sign a surreal vision of normalcy after what I'd experienced. A battered pickup truck sat in the gravel lot. Roy's vehicle, I assumed, but no other cars were present. I hesitated at the edge of the forest, suddenly aware of how I must appear. Unshaven, filthy, bloody, carrying a shotgun and looking half wild. In my isolated life, I'd forgotten how frightening such an image would be to regular people. To avoid being shot on sight, I reluctantly stashed the shotgun in the underbrush, marking the location in my mind. I'd retrieve it later if needed. The bell above the door jingled as I entered the store. Roy looked up from his crossword puzzle, recognition slowly dawning on his weathered face. "Mountain man," he said. Then his eyes widened as he took in my condition. "What in God's name happened to you?" "I need to use your phone," I said, my voice hoarse from disuse and dehydration. "Need to call the police." Roy didn't ask questions. He led me behind the counter and pointed to an ancient rotary phone mounted on the wall. "You need an ambulance too, by the looks of it." I nodded gratefully and dialed 911 with trembling fingers. The dispatcher's voice sounded tinny and distant, a connection to a world that suddenly felt foreign. 911, what's your emergency?" "My name is John Erskine," I began, the words tumbling out faster than I could organize them. "I live in a cabin in the Allegheny National Forest. Yesterday evening I found a dead body near my property. 2 men chased me. They tried to kill me. I shot one of them. The other got away wounded." A pause then. "Sir, are you currently in danger?" "I don't think so. I'm at Roy's Gas and Grocery off Route 66, near the eastern forest boundary." "Stay where you are, sir. I'm dispatching officers and an ambulance to your location. They should arrive in approximately 20 minutes. After I hung up, Roy guided me to a chair by the window, his face grave. He didn't press for details, just brought me a bottle of water and a first aid kit from behind the counter. "Been telling you for years these woods ain't right," he said quietly as he helped me clean my wound properly. "Some folks go in and never come out." I wanted to dismiss his words as the superstitious ramblings of a country store owner, but after what I'd seen, I couldn't. Instead, I asked, "Have there been others? Other disappearances?" Roy shrugged. "Official ones. A few hikers every couple years. Rangers say they got lost. Happens in wilderness areas. Unofficial ones." He glanced toward the darkening forest visible through the window. "More than anyone knows." Before I could question him further, red and blue lights flashed in the distance, growing brighter as vehicles approached the store. The cavalry had arrived, though I had no idea if they'd believe my story or dismiss me as a paranoid hermit who'd cracked under the isolation. 2 state police cruisers pulled into the gravel lot, followed by an ambulance. Officers approached cautiously, hands near their holstered weapons, a reasonable precaution given the situation I'd described. The next few hours passed in a blur. Paramedics treated my arm, confirming my self-diagnosis of infection and administering IV antibiotics on site before transporting me to the regional hospital 30 miles away. State police detectives interviewed me in the emergency room, their expressions growing increasingly concerned as I detailed finding the hiker's body, the chase through the forest, and the deadly confrontation at my cabin. "You say you left one assailant's body in your shed?" Detective Mercer, a tall woman with short gray hair and skeptical eyes, asked. "Yes, and I photographed everything." I pointed to my backpack, where the digital camera still waited with its grim evidence. "The other man escaped, but he was wounded. Shotgun pellets caught him in the side." "And you believe these men killed the hiker you found?" "I'm certain of it. They as much as admitted it when they came after me." Mercer exchanged glances with her partner, a younger man named Walsh, whose notepad was filled with my statement. "Mr. Erskine, we'll need you to guide us back to your cabin and the location where you found the initial victim." "When?" "As soon as the doctor clears you. We've already dispatched a forensics team to secure the area based on the coordinates you provided." I nodded, fighting against the exhaustion and medication that threatened to pull me under. "There's something else. The one who got away, he implied they weren't alone. Said there were others." Walsh leaned forward. "Others? Like what, some kind of group?" "I don't know, but he seemed confident, said they'll find you as if he was part of something larger." Mercer's expression darkened. "We've had reports of unusual activity in the eastern section of the forest over the past year. Nothing concrete enough for an investigation, but concerning patterns. What kind of patterns? I asked. Missing hikers who were experienced outdoorsmen, evidence of unauthorized structures deep in restricted areas, unusual vehicle traffic on service roads with no clear purpose. She hesitated, then added, and reports from hunters about finding game that had been killed but not harvested, just left to rot with specific, ritual-like markings. A chill ran through me despite the hospital's warmth. Do you think there's some kind of cult operating out there? I wouldn't use that word officially, Mercer replied carefully. But unofficially, we're concerned about organized activity of an extreme nature, yes. The doctor interrupted then, insisting I needed rest before any forest expedition. The detectives reluctantly agreed to return in the morning, leaving an officer stationed outside my hospital room. For my protection, they assured me, though it felt equally like preventing my escape. Sleep came in fitful bursts, broken by nightmares of being chased through endless trees by faceless figures. I awoke before dawn, disoriented in the sterile hospital environment so different from my rustic cabin. By mid-morning, I'd been cleared for release, my arm properly stitched and bandaged, antibiotics coursing through my system via a portable IV drip the doctors insisted I continue for at least 48 hours. Detectives Mercer and Walsh returned with a forest ranger named Alvarez who would help navigate back to my cabin. The drive through the national forest felt surreal. Main roads gave way to service roads, then to the fire road I had hiked out on the previous day. Finally, we reached the point where vehicles could go no further, and we continued on foot, following trails I knew by heart, but now saw through new eyes. You really lived out here all alone? Ranger Alvarez asked as we hiked, his tone somewhere between admiration and concern. For almost 3 years, I replied. Why? The question came from Walsh, who'd been largely silent during the journey. I considered deflecting, but the events of the past 2 days had stripped away any pretense. I was running from something I couldn't face. Thought I'd find peace in isolation. And did you? Mercer asked. Until 2 days ago? Yes, mostly. We fell silent after that, conserving energy for the hike. As we approached the creek where I'd first found the backpack, tension built within me. What if the body was gone? What if there was no evidence to support my story? My fears proved unfounded. The bright red backpack remained where I'd found it, though animals had scattered its contents further. And the hiker's body lay exactly as I'd left it, now covered with a light dusting of fallen leaves like nature's funeral shroud. Mercer crouched beside the dead man, her expression grim. Blunt force trauma to the back of the skull, defensive wounds on the hands. This was no accident. She spoke into her radio, summoning the forensics team that had been staging nearby. Within minutes, the quiet clearing became a hive of activity as technicians in blue jumpsuits photographed, measured, and collected evidence. We continued to my cabin, where a similar scene awaited. The thin man's body had been removed from my shed and lay wrapped in a body bag near a coroner's vehicle that had somehow navigated the rough terrain. Inside the cabin, technicians dusted for fingerprints and cataloged the blood spatter pattern from the shotgun blast. Everything matches your statement, Mr. Erskine, Mercer acknowledged, a new respect in her voice. But we still need to find the second assailant. You think he's still out here? With those injuries? He would have needed medical attention. We've alerted hospitals in a 100-mile radius, but so far, nothing. I gazed around at the forest surrounding my small clearing, suddenly aware of how vast and impenetrable it truly was. If what he said is true about others, they might have their own medical supplies, their own facilities. Mercer nodded slowly. That's our concern as well. Over the next week, my small cabin became the center of an expanding investigation. The dead hiker was identified as Gregory Voss, a 32-year-old environmental engineer from Pittsburgh who had been reported missing after failing to return from a weekend hike. The thin man I'd killed was identified through fingerprints as Wesley Simmons, 41, with a record of assault and suspected ties to extremist groups. I stayed at a motel in the nearest town, giving daily statements as investigators pieced together what had happened. They brought in specialists from the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, experts in tracking organized violent groups operating in remote areas. 10 days after the incident, Mercer invited me to a briefing at the state police headquarters. A conference room had been transformed into an incident command center, with maps of the national forest covering one wall, marked with pins indicating known locations of interest. "We believe we've identified an encampment approximately 7 miles northwest of your cabin," Mercer explained, pointing to a red circle on the map. "Aerial surveillance shows evidence of structures and activity well outside permitted camping areas." "What kind of activity?" I asked. An FBI agent named Powell stepped forward. "Based on satellite imagery and thermal scanning, we estimate between 15 and 20 individuals. They've constructed semi-permanent shelters, dug waste pits, created what appears to be a defensive perimeter. Are they armed?" Powell nodded grimly. "Almost certainly. We've intercepted encrypted radio communications suggesting a well-organized group with military-style protocols." "Who are they?" Mercer exchanged glances with Powell before responding. "We believe they're part of a larger network called the Forest Brotherhood, an extremist survivalist group with apocalyptic beliefs. They see wilderness areas as the last bastion against what they consider societal collapse." "And they kill hikers?" I asked incredulously. "They kill anyone they consider a threat to their territory," Powell clarified. "Their ideology combines extreme anti-government views with nature worship and isolationism. They believe they're the rightful stewards of the forest." I thought about my own retreat from society, how I'd sought isolation as a refuge. Had I been unconsciously mimicking the very group that had nearly killed me? "What happens now?" I asked. "We're planning a coordinated operation to secure the encampment," Mercer said. "State police tactical units with FBI support. It's scheduled for tomorrow at dawn." "And me? What should I do?" Powell studied me with calculating eyes. "That depends. Are you planning to return to your cabin?" The question caught me off guard. I hadn't thought that far ahead, had been existing in a stunned day-to-day survival mode since the attack. "I don't know," I admitted. "Can I?" "Physically, yes. Once the investigation concludes, the property remains yours. But psychologically?" Powell shrugged. "That's something only you can decide." That night, alone in my sterile motel room with its buzzing fluorescent lights and paper-thin walls, I faced the question head-on. Could I return to my solitary existence after what had happened? Would the forest ever feel like sanctuary again? Or would every shadow hide potential threats, every unexpected sound trigger memories of that night? More importantly, should I return? My retreat to isolation had been a response to trauma, a way of avoiding responsibility and human connection. It had felt like wisdom at the time, but now I wondered if it had just been elaborate cowardice. Dawn broke with the sound of helicopter rotors passing overhead. The operation against the Forest Brotherhood encampment was underway. I watched through my window as military-style vehicles rolled through town, heading toward the national forest. Hours later, Mercer called to report success. 12 members of the group had been arrested without casualties. Others had escaped deeper into the wilderness but were being tracked. Among those captured was the heavier man from that night, still recovering from his shotgun wounds. His name was Russell Blackwell, a former Army Ranger discharged for disciplinary reasons who had been with the Forest Brotherhood for at least 3 years. "He's talking," Mercer told me, "trying to cut a deal. Says the group has killed at least 7 people who ventured too close to their territory over the past year." "Was I a target?" I asked. "Did they know about me before I found the hiker?" "According to Blackwell, they knew about your cabin but considered you a kindred spirit, someone else who'd rejected society. They left you alone until you witnessed them with Voss's body." The irony wasn't lost on me. My isolation had both protected and endangered me, marking me as similar to the killers while simultaneously making me vulnerable when they turned on me. A week later, after giving final statements and signing countless documents, I returned to my cabin with a police escort. The crime scene tape had been removed, but evidence of the investigation remained. Boot prints in the dirt, fingerprint powder on surfaces, the lingering smell of chemicals used to detect blood traces. The officers offered to stay while I gathered personal belongings, assuming I wouldn't want to remain. I thanked them, but declined. I needed to be alone with the place, to feel whether it was still home or simply the scene of a nightmare. After they left, I stood in the center of my small clearing as evening approached. The forest stretched around me, ancient trees indifferent to the human drama that had played out beneath them. Birds called, squirrels chattered, leaves rustled in the gentle breeze, the eternal conversation of the woodland continuing as it had for centuries. I walked the perimeter of my property, touching familiar trees, noting how quickly nature had begun reclaiming the areas disturbed by the investigation. Near the creek where I'd found Voss's body, wildflowers had already started growing over the trampled ground. Inside the cabin, I lit a fire in the wood stove and sat before it on my simple wooden chair. The bloodstains had been cleaned from the floor, the broken door repaired by the forensics team after they finished their work. Yet the space felt irreparably altered, as if the violence had seeped into the very logs. As darkness fell, I made my decision. This chapter of my life had ended the moment I found that backpack by the creek. Staying would mean living with ghosts, both literal and metaphorical, and perpetuating a retreat from life that had proven more dangerous than healing. The next morning I began packing the few possessions I wanted to keep. My grandfather's pocket watch, journals I'd kept during my time here, tools handed down through generations. The rest, furniture, supplies, the structure itself, I would leave behind, perhaps for another seeker who needed temporary refuge but not permanent escape. 2 weeks later, I signed paperwork donating the cabin and surrounding acre to a wilderness education program for troubled youth. The irony felt appropriate. What had been my hiding place would become a place of growth and reconnection for others. I moved to a small town on the edge of the forest, close enough to visit the woods on day hikes, but firmly within the realm of community and connection. I found work as a carpenter's assistant, using skills honed during my solitary years for something productive. In the evenings, I began writing about my experiences, first as therapy, then as something that might help others understand the fine line between healthy solitude and dangerous isolation. Sometimes at night, I still dream of that evening, finding the body, the chase through darkening woods, the desperate struggle in my cabin. I wake with my heart pounding, sheets damp with sweat, momentarily disoriented until the sound of distant traffic or a neighbor's radio grounds me in the present. But those episodes grow less frequent with time. What remains more persistent is a heightened awareness of shadows in peripheral vision, of subtle changes in forest sounds, of the capacity for darkness that exists in isolated minds. The investigation into the Forest Brotherhood continued for months, uncovering a network that stretched across multiple national forests in the eastern United States. More arrests followed. More evidence of killings emerged. I testified at several trials, facing Russell Blackwell across courtrooms as he glared at me with undimmed hatred. During the final trial, he spoke directly to me during his statement to the court. "You think you've escaped, but you're still one of us. Still a man who ran from the world. The only difference is you ran back when things got hard." His words haunted me, containing just enough truth to sting. But over time, I recognized the fundamental difference between us. I had sought isolation to heal, while he and his brotherhood had sought it to nurture hatred and violence. My retreat had been a temporary shelter. Theirs was a fortress built to wage war. Now, 3 years since that blood-soaked night, I walk in the forest with open eyes, neither fearing its depths nor idealizing its solitude. The woods are neither malevolent nor benevolent. They simply are, vast and ancient and indifferent to human concerns. They can shelter both the healer and the killer, the seeker and the lost. I no longer live alone, but I haven't forgotten what solitude taught me, that we need both connection and space, community and individuality, to be fully human. The forest remains a part of my life, but as a place I visit rather than a place I hide. Sometimes, on clear autumn days when the leaves begin to turn, I hike near my old cabin. The education program has maintained it well, adding solar panels and improving the water collection system. Young voices echo where once there was only silence, learning the names of trees and the habits of wildlife, discovering that nature can be both teacher and healer. I never stay long, never visit after dusk. Some memories are best left undisturbed, like the leaves that cover the forest floor, gradually decomposing to nourish new growth. The past remains, feeding the present, but no longer defining it. As I turn to leave, I sometimes pause at the ridge overlooking the small valley where I once made my solitary home. The forest stretches in all directions, beautiful and mysterious and complex, much like the human heart that seeks both connection and solitude, safety and risk, retreat and return. I take a deep breath of pine-scented air, adjust my pack, and head back toward town, toward light and noise and the messy miracle of human community. The path leads forward, not back. And despite everything, I wouldn't have it any other way. I never considered myself someone who collected dolls. Throughout my childhood, toys held little fascination for me. While other girls my age accumulated stuffed animals and plastic figurines, I found myself drawn to books and outdoor adventures. The few toys I did own could easily be counted on both hands, and by the time I turned 14, I had given most away to younger cousins in the family. The larger of my two porcelain dolls came into my possession when I was 10 years old, a birthday gift from my closest friend, Jade. We had been inseparable since first grade, sharing secrets and spending countless afternoons exploring the woods behind my house. The doll arrived in an ornate box, its face hauntingly lifelike with pale, unblemished skin and deep, almost iridescent blue eyes that seemed to shift color depending on how the light hit them. "This isn't just any doll," my grandmother informed me after the birthday party had ended. She held it carefully, her weathered hands contrasting with the doll's pristine features. "Porcelain dolls like this one are collector's items. They're meant to be displayed, not played with." I nodded, somewhat indifferent at the time. The doll wore an elaborate Victorian-style dress of deep burgundy with intricate lace details and a matching wide-brimmed hat that cast shadows across its face when positioned just so. I placed it on my dresser, where it remained largely forgotten as I continued my ordinary 10-year-old life. The smaller doll joined my reluctant collection approximately 2 years later as an Easter gift from my grandmother. Unlike its counterpart, this doll featured softer features, rosy cheeks, a gentle smile, and light brown hair arranged in perfect ringlets. My two sisters received identical dolls that Easter morning, though theirs mysteriously disappeared within months. Whether lost during our frequent relocations or deliberately misplaced due to growing discomfort, neither sister seemed particularly troubled by their absence. I've now had these dolls for nearly 12 years. I'm 24 as I document these experiences, having carried these porcelain companions through 3 different homes, 2 college dormitories, and now my first apartment. During this time, I've accumulated a series of incidents that I can no longer dismiss as coincidence or imagination. What follows is my attempt to chronicle these events in the hope that committing them to paper might provide some clarity, or at the very least, a record should the occurrences continue to escalate. Our log cabin home sat nestled against the edge of dense woodland, the kind of picturesque rural setting that appears idyllic in daylight, but transforms into something altogether more sinister after sunset. We had lived there approximately 3 years when my sisters came to live with us following my parents' separation. The adjustment period was challenging as we established new routines and boundaries. The cabin's rustic charm extended to creaking floorboards and settling noises that became the soundtrack of our nights. At first, we attributed every unexpected sound to the natural movements of an aging wooden structure. However, certain occurrences defied such rational explanations. The first incident I can recall with absolute clarity happened during a thunderstorm in late autumn. Power outages were common in our remote location, so we had gathered in the living room with flashlights and candles, telling ghost stories to pass the time. My younger sister Irene, 13 at the time, had just finished recounting a particularly chilling tale when the conversation turned to items in our home that made them uncomfortable. "That porcelain doll on your dresser," Irene said, her voice lowering instinctively. "The way it watches from under that hat. I can't stand being alone in your room with it." My middle sister, Vanessa, nodded in agreement. "Every time I walk past your room, I feel like it's following me with its eyes." I laughed dismissively. "It's just a doll. It's not even particularly well made. Most of its eyelashes have fallen off." "Would you mind pushing the hat down over its face when we're home?" Irene asked. "Just so it isn't looking at us." To humor them, I agreed, though I found their concern amusing. I had owned the larger doll for nearly 4 years by then and had never felt anything unsettling about it. My more spiritually inclined friend Renee had once suggested that perhaps the dolls had formed some attachment to me as their owner. This explanation seemed fanciful, but harmless. That night, after the power returned and my sisters had fallen asleep, I sat at my desk completing homework. From the corner of my eye, I noticed something unusual. The doll's hat had shifted slightly, exposing one glazed eye that seemed to be angled directly toward me. I distinctly remembered pushing the hat down as promised, making sure both eyes were completely covered. Dismissing it as a result of the house settling, or perhaps my own imperfect memory, I approached the doll and readjusted its hat. As my fingers brushed against the porcelain face, I noted with surprise that it felt unusually warm to the touch, almost as if it retained body heat. The scientific part of my mind immediately sought explanations. Perhaps it had been sitting near my reading lamp, absorbing heat from the bulb. I returned to my homework, but found myself unable to concentrate, repeatedly glancing back at the doll on my dresser. That night, for the first time, I turned it to face the wall before going to sleep. In the following weeks, I began noticing small irregularities. Items on my dresser would be slightly rearranged. The doll's hat would be raised, despite my consistent efforts to keep it lowered. Once, I returned from school to find the doll had rotated approximately 45 degrees from its previous position. When I mentioned these observations casually to my grandmother, she dismissed them with practical explanations: the house settling, drafts from the poorly sealed windows, or perhaps my sisters entering my room despite our agreement about personal space. These explanations satisfied me temporarily, but couldn't account for what happened next. Within months of moving in, both of my sisters had developed elaborate rituals before entering my bedroom. Irene would knock 3 times, call my name, and wait for a response before crossing the threshold. Vanessa refused to enter unless I was physically present in the room. When questioned about these behaviors, both admitted their discomfort stemmed from the porcelain dolls. "They watch us," Vanessa explained one evening as we prepared dinner together. "Not just the way normal dolls seem to stare. They actively track movement." "That's impossible," I countered, slicing vegetables with perhaps more force than necessary. "They're inanimate objects." "Then why do you always find the hat raised when you've pushed it down?" she challenged. "And why does the smaller one always end up facing the door, no matter which way you position it?" I had no satisfactory answer, having noticed these phenomena myself, but dismissed them as coincidence or faulty memory. The following weekend, Irene approached me with an unusually serious expression. "Something happened yesterday when you were at swim practice," she began, fidgeting with her bracelet. "I needed to borrow your graphing calculator for math homework. I called for Grandma, but she was in the garden and couldn't hear me." She paused, seeming to gather courage before continuing. "I stood at your doorway for almost 5 minutes, trying to work up the nerve to go in alone. The larger doll was on your dresser where it always is, but something felt different. The atmosphere in your room felt pressurized somehow, like the air before a severe storm." Irene described how she finally entered, keeping her eyes averted from the dresser as she moved toward my desk. I found the calculator and turned to leave, but something compelled me to look at the doll. The hat was raised completely, and I absolutely swear, its head had turned to follow my movement across the room. She had dropped the calculator and fled downstairs, refusing to return to the second floor until our grandmother or I was home. When I checked later, the calculator lay on the floor precisely where she claimed to have dropped it, and the doll sat on the dresser with its hat fully raised, though I had lowered it before leaving that morning. That night, I conducted a simple experiment. Before going to bed, I positioned both dolls facing the wall, measuring the exact distance between them and marking their positions with small strips of tape on the dresser surface. I took photographs with my phone to document their arrangement. When I woke the next morning, the smaller doll remained in position, but the larger one had rotated approximately 30 degrees toward my bed. The tape marker remained in place, indicating the doll had moved without disturbing its base. I checked my phone. The photograph confirmed my memory wasn't faulty. Something had shifted the doll's position during the night. The summer I turned 17, I traveled to Florida to stay with relatives for 6 weeks. Before leaving, I made special arrangements for my dolls at my sister's insistence. I placed the larger doll facing my bed with its hat pulled down completely over its face. The smaller doll I positioned on a bookshelf, facing away from the room entirely. My sisters shared the large bedroom with me in our log cabin home, a spacious area that accommodated 3 full-sized beds, a futon, television, and 3 dressers with room to spare. Despite sharing this space, they requested these specific arrangements to ensure their comfort during my absence. 2 weeks into my trip, I received a disturbing phone call from Vanessa. Her voice trembled as she recounted what had occurred earlier that day. "I was coming up the stairs to get my laptop charger," she began, her words rushing together. "You know how the staircase has that landing where you can see into our room through the banister? Well, I was about halfway up when I glanced over." She paused, and I could hear her taking deep breaths to steady herself. "The larger doll was sitting on your dresser, facing the staircase directly. Its hat was completely raised, and its head, I swear this is true, was angled downward as if it was watching me climb the stairs. I know exactly how we left it before you left. Irene and I both made sure of it." Vanessa described how she had frozen on the stairs, unable to continue upward or retreat back down for several terrifying seconds. When she finally regained control of her limbs, she raced back down to the kitchen where our grandmother was preparing lunch. "The worst part," she continued, "is what Irene told me afterward. She swears that 2 days ago she found the doll sitting on your bed, partially covered by your blankets as if it had crawled under them itself. She put it back on the dresser, fixed the hat, and didn't tell me because she thought I'd done it as a prank." This revelation disturbed me more than I wanted to admit. My grandmother, ever practical, suggested that perhaps one of them had moved the doll subconsciously or forgotten doing so. When I returned home 3 weeks later, I found the larger doll exactly where Vanessa described, on the dresser, facing outward, with its hat raised to expose its glass eyes. The smaller doll, however, had disappeared entirely from the bookshelf. After a thorough search, I discovered it inside my closet, nestled between winter sweaters that hadn't been touched in months. That night, I experienced something that confirmed my sister's experiences weren't mere imagination. I awoke around 3 in the morning to the distinct sensation of being watched. The moonlight filtering through my curtains provided just enough illumination to make out shapes in the darkness. As my eyes adjusted, I realized with growing horror that both dolls now sat at the foot of my bed, their pale faces turned toward me. I remained perfectly still, convinced I must be dreaming or experiencing sleep paralysis. I forced myself to close my eyes and count slowly to 100. When I opened them again, the dolls had returned to their original positions, the larger one on the dresser, the smaller on the bookshelf. In the morning, I dismissed the incident as a particularly vivid nightmare. Yet the lingering doubt remained, intensified by the discovery of a small tear in my comforter precisely where I had seen the dolls sitting in my supposed dream. 2 years later, my family relocated to a modern 2-story home across town. The move represented a fresh start for all of us, away from the creaking floors and drafty windows of the log cabin. My bedroom in the new house was smaller but brighter, with large windows that eliminated the shadowy corners I had grown accustomed to. For the first time, I seriously considered not bringing the porcelain dolls. They sat in a moving box for nearly 3 weeks after we'd settled in, until guilt, or perhaps some inexplicable sense of obligation, compelled me to unpack them. I arranged them on a wooden bookshelf near my door, positioning them between novels so they appeared more like casual decorations than focal points. My grandmother, who lived with us, seemed relieved by the new home's solid construction and absence of unexplained noises. The first month passed uneventfully, leading us all to relax into our new routines. I had been accepted to a nearby university and was preparing for my freshman year, spending long hours studying and rarely paying attention to the dolls. One morning in early autumn, my grandmother approached me during breakfast with an unusual question. "Did you hear someone knocking in your room last night?" she asked, stirring her tea with unnecessary focus. "No," I replied, confused. "I slept through the night. Why?" She described waking around 2:30 a.m. to the distinct sound of knocking. Not gentle tapping, but deliberate, forceful impacts, as if someone were pounding a fist against wood. The sound had come from the direction of my bedroom, she was certain. "I thought perhaps your mini-fridge was malfunctioning," she continued. Sometimes they make that knocking sound when the compressor is failing. Concerned, I checked the mini fridge immediately after breakfast, but it was functioning perfectly. No unusual sounds or temperature issues. I inspected my entire room carefully, but found nothing that could explain the knocking my grandmother had heard. 3 nights later, it happened again. This time, I was studying late in the living room when my grandmother appeared in the doorway, her face pale. "There's that knocking again," she whispered. "Coming from your room." Together we walked upstairs, but as we approached my bedroom, the sound abruptly ceased. My door stood partially open, exactly as I had left it. Inside, nothing appeared disturbed. The porcelain dolls sat on their shelf, their glassy eyes reflecting the hallway light. My grandmother, always practical and skeptical of supernatural explanations, suggested we check the attic access panel in the ceiling outside my room, thinking perhaps an animal had become trapped. We found nothing. She then proposed the knocking might be coming from the pipes within the walls, though the plumber who inspected them the following day found no issues. The knocking occurred twice more during the following week, always when I wasn't in my room and always stopping before I could reach the source. On the 5th occurrence, something different happened. My grandmother heard the now familiar pounding and immediately called for me. I sprinted upstairs, determined to catch whatever was causing the disturbance. As I reached the top step, I heard it clearly. 3 distinct knocks against wood, followed by silence, then 3 more. The sound emanated unquestionably from my bedroom. I pushed the door open fully and flipped on the light. The room appeared exactly as I had left it, with one exception. The smaller porcelain doll lay on the floor beneath the bookshelf, as if it had fallen or been thrown. Its tiny porcelain hand rested against the wooden baseboard, precisely the spot from which the knocking seemed to originate. I stood frozen in the doorway, unable to reconcile what I was seeing with what I knew to be possible. My grandmother appeared behind me, her breath catching as she observed the scene. "It must have fallen," she said finally, her voice strained. "The shelf might be uneven." I nodded mutely and entered the room to retrieve the doll. As I lifted it, I noticed something that made my stomach constrict. A small chip in its porcelain hand, fresh and sharp-edged, revealing the chalky white material beneath the glazed surface. The location of the chip aligned perfectly with where it would strike the baseboard if used to knock. That night, I packed both dolls carefully in a storage container and placed them in the back of my closet. Neither my grandmother nor I mentioned the incident again, as if by mutual unspoken agreement. For several weeks, our home remained blissfully quiet at night. During my freshman year of college, I returned home primarily for holidays and occasional weekends. The dolls remained sealed in their container in my closet, undisturbed and largely forgotten as I adapted to campus life. My sisters had both moved out by then, Vanessa to attend a university on the opposite coast, and Irene to live with our father in another state. The Christmas break of my sophomore year brought an unexpected visitor to our home. Rebecca, a childhood friend who had moved away during middle school, had returned to town to visit relatives. Having reconnected through social media, she eagerly accepted my invitation for dinner at our house. The evening progressed pleasantly with conversation and reminiscing until Rebecca mentioned hearing about those creepy dolls from mutual friends. My grandmother tensed visibly across the table, but I laughed it off, explaining that my sisters had always been unnecessarily frightened by perfectly ordinary porcelain dolls. "I'd love to see them," Rebecca said, her eyes bright with curiosity. "I've always been fascinated by supposedly haunted objects." Reluctantly, I led her upstairs to my bedroom. The storage container remained untouched in my closet, gathering dust. I hesitated before opening it, surprised by my own reluctance. Rebecca watched eagerly as I removed the lid and carefully unwrapped the tissue paper surrounding the larger doll. Its face emerged from the wrappings, the painted features somehow more vivid than I remembered. The blue eyes caught the light, creating the illusion of depth where none should exist. Rebecca gasped appreciatively, reaching out to touch the fabric of its dress. "It's beautiful," she murmured. "Can I take a picture to show my mom? She collects antique dolls." I nodded absently, distracted by the smaller doll still nestled in tissue paper. Something about its position seemed wrong, though I couldn't immediately identify what bothered me. As Rebecca positioned her phone to photograph the larger doll, I realized what had caught my attention. The smaller doll's head had rotated within its wrappings, its face now pressed against the transparent plastic of the container as if peering outward. "Wait until I take it out completely," I said, reaching for the larger doll to position it better for the photograph. As I lifted it from the container, the hat fell back, exposing its face entirely. Rebecca aimed her phone and tapped the screen to focus. Suddenly, she jerked backward, nearly dropping her phone in the process. "Did you see that?" she asked, her voice high with alarm. "See what?" Its eyes. They moved. Just as I took the picture, they flicked to the side, looking directly at the camera. I dismissed her claim immediately. "That's impossible. It's a fixed porcelain doll." Rebecca thrust her phone toward me, her hand trembling slightly. "Look at the picture. Tell me what you see." The photograph showed the doll held in my hands, its face clearly visible. What struck me was the direction of its gaze. While I remembered its eyes facing forward as they always had, in the image they were undeniably shifted toward the camera lens, creating the unsettling impression of direct eye contact with the viewer. "It's just the angle," I said firmly, though doubt crept through me. Or maybe a reflection on the glass eyes. Rebecca wasn't convinced. She insisted on taking another photograph, this time recording a short video as well. In the second image, the doll's eyes appeared normal, facing forward as expected. The video showed nothing unusual, just a porcelain doll held in my increasingly unsteady hands. After Rebecca left that evening, I examined the dolls more carefully. The smaller one had indeed shifted position within its wrappings, though I had sealed the container months ago and it had remained undisturbed in my closet. The larger doll's eyes appeared normal now, but I couldn't dismiss what I had seen in the photograph. Against my better judgment, I decided to place them on my desk rather than return them to storage. Perhaps constant observation would provide answers to questions I had been avoiding for years. That night, I awoke to the sound of something scratching gently against wood. Keeping my breathing steady and my eyes nearly closed, I scanned the darkened room. The dolls remained on my desk, their outlines visible in the faint glow from my alarm clock. As I watched through half-lidded eyes, the scratching sound came again. The larger doll's arm moved, a tiny, almost imperceptible motion. Its porcelain hand dragged across the wooden surface of the desk, creating the scratching noise I had heard. I remained perfectly still, fear constricting my throat as I witnessed what should have been impossible. The doll's head rotated slowly until its eyes fixed on my position in the bed. Though I couldn't make out its expression clearly in the darkness, I felt with absolute certainty that it was aware of my consciousness. After what seemed like hours but was likely only minutes, I summoned the courage to reach for my bedside lamp. The instant light flooded the room. All movement ceased. Both dolls sat innocently on the desk, positioned exactly as I had left them before going to sleep. The following morning, I examined the desk surface carefully, finding 3 tiny scratch marks in the wood where the doll's hand had rested. The incidents grew more frequent after Rebecca's visit, as if her acknowledgement of the doll's strange properties had somehow emboldened them. I returned to university after the holiday break with a mixture of relief and guilt, having once again sealed the dolls in their container and placed them in my closet. My junior year brought new challenges and distractions that pushed thoughts of the dolls to the periphery of my consciousness. I moved into an off-campus apartment with 2 roommates, immersed myself in my studies, and began an internship that consumed most of my free time. For nearly 8 months, I managed to visit home only briefly, never staying overnight. When summer arrived, however, financial necessity required me to move back into my childhood bedroom temporarily. The storage container remained undisturbed in my closet, exactly where I had left it. For the first week, I avoided opening it, telling myself I had outgrown such childish fears. My grandmother noticed my avoidance but said nothing until one evening when we sat alone on the back porch, watching fireflies emerge in the gathering dusk. "They've been active while you were gone," she said quietly, not needing to specify what "they" referred to. I turned to her in surprise. My grandmother had always been the voice of reason, offering logical explanations for every strange occurrence. Her acknowledgement of the doll's activity represented a significant departure from her usual pragmatism. "What happened?" I asked, uncertain if I truly wanted to know. She sighed, her gaze fixed on the darkening yard. The knocking returned about 2 months after you left. Always from your closet, always 3 distinct knocks followed by silence, then 3 more. I ignored it at first. She described how, after several weeks of this pattern, she had finally entered my room and opened the closet, finding the storage container exactly as I had left it. When she removed the lid, however, both dolls were positioned differently than I had placed them, sitting upright, facing the closet door as if waiting for it to open. I told myself I was being foolish, she continued, that you must have positioned them that way before leaving. But I know you didn't. What followed was a detailed account of increasingly disturbing events. My grandmother described finding the closet door open on multiple occasions, despite having closed it securely. She mentioned items in my room being rearranged, books removed from shelves, desk drawers partially opened, my bedspread disturbed as if someone had sat on its edge. "The last incident happened just 3 days before you came home," she said, her voice dropping to near a whisper. "I was awakened by what sounded like footsteps in your room. Light, careful steps moving from the closet to your bed and back again. I gathered my courage and opened your door without warning, turning on the light immediately." My grandmother's hands trembled slightly as she described what she had seen, the larger doll sitting on my pillow, the smaller one positioned at the foot of the bed. The storage container in the closet stood open, its lid on the floor beside it. "I convinced myself I must have checked the container earlier and forgotten to secure it properly," she said. "That perhaps the house settling had caused the dolls to fall into those positions. But deep down, I knew better." That night, after my grandmother had gone to bed, I approached my closet with determined steps. The time for avoidance had passed. I opened the door and knelt before the storage container, removing its lid slowly. Both dolls lay wrapped in tissue paper, positioned horizontally as one would expect. Nothing appeared unusual or disturbed. I unwrapped them carefully, examining each for signs of damage or alteration. Finding nothing, I made a decision. I placed both dolls on my dresser, positioning them side by side facing my bed. Then I took out my phone and opened a time-lapse recording application. I set the phone on my bookshelf, aimed toward the dresser, and programmed it to capture one frame every 30 seconds throughout the night. With this surveillance in place, I went to bed, leaving a small lamp illuminated to ensure the camera would capture any movement. Despite my exhaustion, sleep evaded me for hours as I periodically opened my eyes to check the dolls' positions. They remained motionless until I finally drifted off around 2 in the morning. The harsh sound of my alarm woke me at 7. Sunlight streamed through my curtains, casting the room in a warm glow that seemed to contradict the uneasiness I felt. My first glance confirmed what I both expected and dreaded. The dolls had moved. The larger one now stood at the edge of the dresser, its porcelain hand extended outward as if reaching toward my bed. The smaller doll had rotated completely, its back now facing the room. With trembling fingers, I retrieved my phone and opened the time-lapse recording. The footage began normally, showing the dolls positioned as I had left them. For the first 2 hours, nothing changed. Then, at approximately 1:42 a.m., according to the timestamp, the smaller doll's head rotated slowly, a movement that should have been physically impossible given its fixed porcelain construction. At 2:17 a.m., the larger doll began to move. Unlike the smaller one's subtle shift, this movement was more pronounced. It appeared to lift itself incrementally, using tiny, jerking motions to change its position until it stood at the dresser's edge, arm extended. The recording continued until morning, showing no further movement after the dolls reached the positions in which I found them. I replayed the footage 3 times, searching for signs of manipulation or natural explanation. Finding none, I was forced to confront the reality I had been avoiding for years. The dolls moved on their own. I am 24 now, sitting in my first solo apartment with both porcelain dolls displayed on a shelf across from my desk. After years of unexplained phenomena, I have reached an unusual arrangement with these inanimate yet somehow conscious objects. Following the recorded evidence of their movement, I spent months researching similar accounts, consulting with collectors of antique dolls, and even meeting discreetly with a paranormal investigator recommended by Rebecca. None provided satisfactory explanations for what I had experienced and documented. The paranormal investigator suggested the dolls might host attachments, spirits or energies bound to the physical objects for reasons unknown. She recommended destroying them to sever the connection. The doll collector warned that breaking porcelain dolls was considered deeply unlucky in multiple cultures, potentially releasing whatever essence they contained. My grandmother, in a surprising departure from her lifelong skepticism, suggested a third option. They've never harmed you, she pointed out. Their activities increase when you're absent or ignoring them, but remain relatively benign when you acknowledge their presence. This observation aligned with my own experiences. The most dramatic incidents had occurred during periods when I had stored the dolls away or left home for extended periods. When displayed openly and treated with a certain degree of acknowledgement, their activities diminished in frequency and intensity. So began our strange coexistence. I keep the dolls displayed prominently in whatever space I inhabit. Each morning, I acknowledge them verbally, a simple greeting that feels both ridiculous and necessary. When traveling, I inform them of my departure date and expected return, placing them in positions facing the door as if awaiting my return. In exchange, their movements have become more subtle and less frequent. Objects in my apartment remain undisturbed. The knocking has ceased entirely. Occasionally, I still find them in slightly altered positions, particularly after mentioning them to others or writing about them as I am doing now. As I complete this account, I notice the smaller doll has rotated slightly to face the computer screen. The larger one remains in position, though its hat has raised just enough to expose its glass eyes. I feel their attention focused on my words, perhaps curious about how their story will be told. I have accepted that I may never understand what animates these porcelain figures. Perhaps they contain energies beyond scientific explanation. Perhaps long years of projected emotions and fears have somehow manifested in physical movement. Perhaps there is a perfectly rational explanation that continues to elude me. What I know with certainty is that destroying them feels wrong, not merely out of superstition, but from a deeper sense that they are, in their way, attached to me as their caretaker. They have followed me through childhood into adulthood, witnessing my development with their unchanging porcelain faces. In strange moments of honesty with myself, I acknowledge that I would miss their presence if they were gone. So we continue our unusual relationship, these watching dolls and I. They remain mostly still when observed, coming alive in the periphery of my attention or during the unguarded hours of night. I maintain my rituals of acknowledgement, treating them with a respect that feels earned rather than irrational. Sometimes, in the darkest hours before dawn, I awaken to find the larger doll has moved closer to my bedside. Its painted face reveals nothing, but I sense something almost protective in its posture. As if having attached itself to me, it now stands guard against other, less familiar entities that might wish me harm. "Good morning," I say to them now as I prepare to end this writing session. "Thank you for letting me share your story." The air in my apartment feels momentarily heavy, then settles. Outside my window, the world continues its normal rhythms, unaware of the small, inexplicable reality we have created here. I save this document and close my laptop, turning to face my porcelain companions directly. Their glass eyes reflect the afternoon light, revealing nothing and everything about our shared history. I no longer fear what I don't understand. Some mysteries, I have learned, are best left unexamined too closely, respected from a careful distance, acknowledged but not disturbed. And so we watch each other, these dolls and I, neither fully understanding the other, but having reached a form of peace in our mutual observation. Sometimes I wonder who is really the watcher and who is being watched. Perhaps in the end, it doesn't matter. We have found our equilibrium in this strange, unspoken arrangement, and for now, that seems enough.